Good afternoon, everyone. And the first item of business today, this afternoon, is a debate on motion number S4M 06766 in the name of Keith Brown on transforming Scotland's railways. I invite members who wish to speak in this debate to press the request to speak buttons now or as soon as possible. Mr Brown, up to 14 minutes. We are extremely tight for time today, so if members could stick to the time limits, that would be hugely helpful. Minister, 14 minutes, please.
Presiding Officer, Scotland's railways are, in my view, in the midst of a transformation, and there is a real success story to tell. And I think now is the right time to take account of our achievements as we plan for the next franchise and rail investment periods. The network performance is up and passenger satisfaction reached a high this year, confirming that rail's performance impacts significantly on passengers' opinions of the rail system. For my part, I would congratulate both Network Rail and First ScotRail on their efforts. While we have benefited from a relatively mild winter this year, this reflects their successful collaboration. I should say as well that whether it's services, lines, rolling stock, all these things, performance, we of course recognise the fact there is more to do, but there is a good story to tell about what's been done so far. And one example of that is that passenger figures today are higher than in the last golden age of rail in the 1920s and 30s. Last year, there were a staggering 83 million passenger journeys in Scotland, a 33% increase since the start of the current franchise. And that figure undermines the beaching assumption that rail would lose out to the car and rail passenger numbers would wither. This government has been instrumental in reversing some of the beaching cuts and creating for Scotland, I believe, the possibility of a new golden age of rail. Nothing illustrates that more clearly than our commitment to the new Borders railway line. A link that has been broken for 40 years will reconnect communities in the Scottish Borders and Midlothian with our nation's capital. And we have recently seen the positive impact of bringing communities together by the reopening earlier this year of Conan Bridge Station in the Highlands. We have also completed Phase 1 of the Highland Main Line project, providing 2 additional services from 2011 and journey time improvements of up to 18 minutes on some services from December 2012. And further south in the Central Belt, the Airdrie to Bathgate project, which received cross-party support in the Parliament, provided a new through line from the west of Scotland to Edinburgh with new stations and new travel opportunities. And we have ensured our new stations are accessible, offering step-free access for those with reduced mobility, increasing the number of accessible stations across Scotland. We have also made passenger journeys more comfortable, investing over £430 million in new electric and refurbished rolling stock. We are also enhancing the passenger experience, providing Wi-Fi and modern appropriate facilities. We are making strides towards better integration of services and between services and other modes. Our commitment is manifest in the recent opening of Scotland's first rail cycle hub in Stirling, and this exciting 3-year pilot will offer expert knowledge on local roads and cycling facilities, and it will also raise the profile of greener, active transport options to reach our rail stations. In respect of cross-border rail, there have been huge successes with unprecedented passenger growth, over 144% on Glasgow to London since 2008. And last year we finally saw, after much pressure from Scotland, the introduction of a full hourly timetable between those cities. We have also seen the extension of Edinburgh to Birmingham services to London, opening up new connectivity for passengers. And the recent announcement of an additional 2,500 seats per day on Scotland to Birmingham services underlines the importance of Scotland to the UK rail market, and it dispels the myth that we don't need more passenger and network capacity north of Preston. And yet, despite huge passenger growth, over 261% in fact since 2008, between Scotland and Birmingham, the role of the Scottish people in determining the specification of the franchise on the arterial East and West Coast main lines is and remains extremely limited. We remain at the mercy of Westminster. I have long argued that the prevailing UK legislation prevents me from being empowered to act in the interests of Scotland, and on cross-border issues we should be equals, rather than having Scotland being treated in a subordinate manner. I will indeed.
Stevenson.
Is the Minister aware of the rail improvements that have been made between Belfast and Dublin, where there is an equity of interest and that therefore cross-border rail services can be planned in a way to mutual benefit, as distinct from the one-size, London-size fits-all that we currently experience?
Minister.
I think the example raised by Stuart Stevenson just does point out the fact that cross-border services can be organised in the mutual interest of different countries if the will is there to do that. And I have heard general reports about the success of the line which he mentions. And there is no reason, of course, why an independent Scotland and the rest of the UK could collaborate in that way on cross-border services. On cross-border issues, as I say, we should be being treated as equals, which I think is the point being made by Stuart Stevenson, rather than being treated in a subordinate manner. This is the first time I can remember we have any say whatsoever in the East Coast, West Coast main lines in the future franchises. I see Gavin Brown shaking his head. Perhaps he prefers the outcome of the West Coast mainline franchise process to one of collaboration, where the governments can talk about these things and get it right first time. Looking to the immediate future, we face challenges in the lead-up to 2014. That's when, of course, our country will host the Commonwealth Games and the Ryder Cup, with an increased focus on Scotland, with another Homecoming Scotland year and, of course, the forthcoming referendum. We are in a good place to deliver transport services that meet the expectations of Scotland's residents and their visitors during what will be a milestone year. There have been significant investments in Gleneagles and Dalmarnock stations, along with SPTs, subway improvements, and these will result in better connectivity for Scottish visitors during 2014, as well as increased access to economic and cultural opportunities for residents. Another issue, Presiding Officer, we've dealt with is affordability. I know that the cost of travel is very important for those living and working in Scotland, and I am therefore determined to offer some relief from the current pressures on household budgets. And that's why in December 2012, as part of my statement on the franchise continuation, I announced a freeze on off-peak fare rises and peak fares restricted to RPI. And since then, my officials have worked with ScotRail to identify and eradicate fares anomalies to make our fares fairer. Whilst the UK Government itself has promised to put an end to inflation-busting fares, we are taking action now, and from 2016, I'll come back to the member in just a second, from 2016 we will be going further by ensuring regulated peak fares cannot rise above inflation, and regulated off-peak fares will be restricted to RPI -1. I'll give way to Jenny Marr.
Jenny Marr.
I thank the Minister for giving way, and I welcome his sorting out of the anomalies that he has done so far for Dundee. But would he accept that there are still major anomalies on the Dundee to Edinburgh route that are having a big impact on people's household budgets?
Minister.
In dealing with around, I think, 250,000 journeys where anomalies had occurred, I think we made substantial progress, and it was progress which could have been made many years ago, but hadn't been. So I am convinced that we have made great strides in relation to that, but I do think the next tranche of dealing with anomalies will have to come when we renegotiate the franchise, which is coming very soon. But I'm pleased that at least that the member has acknowledged the work that this government had done, which hadn't been done by previous governments, in addressing anomalies. And turning to the future of the ScotRail franchise, which is due to be renewed in 2015, just to confirm again that we will let 2 new franchises. First of all, the main ScotRail franchise, and of course a separate sleeper franchise. We had the largest ever rail consultation in Scotland, which helped us shape the development of the specifications for these franchises. And more than ever, we are able to specify services that best meet the needs of our cities and rural communities. I have also been mindful of the Laidlaw inquiry and the Brown review into the UK's West Coast mainline fiasco in terms of the franchising process. We have learned the lessons from these where we think that's appropriate. They have informed our franchising process, and I am confident in the competence of the officials in the process which has been followed by Transport Scotland to ensure that we secure a contract that meets our needs and offers value for money. The sleeper franchising process has already commenced. The pre-qualification questionnaires were returned by 4 potential bidders this month, and the draft invitation to tender will be issued in August. For the main ScotRail franchise, the questionnaires will be issued to potential bidders in July this year. That, I think, is still the biggest contract which the Scottish Government enters into in terms of procurement. We have learned, we believe, what Scotland can achieve through the successes of the current franchise, and I intend to ensure that we build on this success for the future. I look to the next ScotRail franchisee to work closely with Network Rail to drive down costs and to improve the passenger experience. I will indeed.
Ken McIntosh.
Would the Minister tell me, is there anything he can do in terms of the current franchise to encourage bidders, either a cooperative bidder or mutual or not-for-dividend bidder, to come forward and bid for the franchise?
Minister.
I think I answered this question previously last week to Ken McIntosh, but just to reiterate, and I'd be interested to know what the Labour Party's position is on this. I can't encourage one bid over another bid. That's the way the process goes. That's what's laid down in law. If the Labour Party say they would encourage one bid over another bid, it would be useful if they were able to confirm that today, because that would be in breach of the procurement regulations. I'm happy to discuss, as I'm sure we will, as we go through the debate, the issues around public ownership of railways. But just to repeat again what I said last week, the previous Labour government between when they first took office in 1997 right through to 2010 did not change the 1993 Act, which of course leaves us in a situation where we can accept public sector bids, but only for foreign countries. We can't have one ourselves. I don't know why the Labour Party supported that position. I don't, but that is the current position. We have asked the current UK government to change that, and they've said they won't do that. In the meantime, I think it's very important that we drive down costs where we can. The current alliance between ScotRail and Network Rail delivered the Paisley Canal electrification programme to record timescales and significantly below the original cost estimates. And today I'm pleased to announce that, subject to approval from the ORR, the Network Rail and First ScotRail will work together through their alliance to accelerate the electrification of the Whifflet route. Now, through close collaboration and application of the approaches which we used for Paisley Canal, we expect that the cost of delivering the project can be reduced below Network Rail's current planning estimate of £29.6 million. And this will be the first major output of the next 5-year rail investment period, known as Control Period 5, which starts on the 1st of April 2014. The route, which runs from Glasgow to Coatbridge, was originally planned for full electrification by 2018-2019. We now plan to deliver this by summer 2014, giving us greater flexibility to support passengers for the Commonwealth Games and the Ryder Cup. And I've mentioned Control Period 5. Last year's high-level output specifications set out over £3 billion worth of capital investment for Control Period 5, putting us on the cusp of the most transformative rail programme that we've ever seen in Scotland. We've also a £30 million Scottish Stations Fund. There's a huge amount of interest in that. I can try and make some more progress just now and see if I have time left at the end. £30 million for the Scottish Stations Fund, which will provide investment for new and improved stations. And I will fund, in addition to that, substantial enhancements between Aberdeen and Inverness. There will be further work on the Highland Main Line, which will reduce journey times and support more efficient freight operations. And these investments, along with the road improvements, including the A9 upgrade, will ensure better connections between our cities and beyond. To ensure our rail services meet the expectations of our local communities, I have made up to £200,000 available over 3 years to 2015 to establish community rail partnerships across Scotland. On the West Highland Line, we are improving connections to the islands and boosting tourism. We have already provided additional Sunday services, and from May 2014, the number of trains between Oban and the Central Belt will double in the summer, from 3 to 6 services each way. In July last year, I announced our £650 million investment in the first phase of the Edinburgh-Glasgow Improvement Programme. Since then, Egypt has made significant progress, delivering new services on the Edinburgh to Glasgow via Carstairs line, a year earlier than planned. The £27 million redevelopment of Haymarket Station is making excellent progress towards opening to passengers later this year, and the electrification of the main Edinburgh to Glasgow line is scheduled for completion by December 2016. And we will fulfil our commitment to the electrification of the Cumbernauld line in time for next year's Commonwealth Games. I intend to publish our Egypt business case soon, and that will set out the delivery of Egypt improvements for the next rail control period, starting with the electrification of the Edinburgh to Glasgow route by December 2016. By December 2018, we will complete the electrification of the Stirling-Alloa-Dunblane line services and have delivered a 42-minute fastest journey time between Edinburgh and Glasgow. And the redevelopment of Glasgow Queen Street Station offers a once-in-a-generation opportunity to transform one of Scotland's most iconic stations, enabling 8-car train operation and increasing capacity on our busiest route. A potential future high-speed rail line in future will further increase capacity and offer speeds of 140 miles an hour and journey times of less than 30 minutes. The additional rail capacity that will bring benefits for the rest of the rail network in the Central Belt and beyond. So, for my part, I am impatient for change. I am bringing forward £5 million in addition for shovel-ready projects at stations. These include car park expansions, cycling facilities and bus interchanges. And through this fund, and along with the future Scottish Stations Fund investment, the bus connectivity to the Borders Railway and the Stirling Cycle Hub, the Government will ensure better transport integration across our rail network in the next franchise period. So, to summarise, Presiding Officer, we are in the midst of a transformation of Scotland's railways. We have made substantial improvements to date, with passenger growth, increased passenger satisfaction and better performance. Our plans for investment in the network and our considered approach and plans for new franchises underline our commitment to rail, and to that extent I ask for the support of the Parliament for my motion. Thank you.
Many thanks. I will now call on Dr Lane Murray to speak to and move Amendment S4M 06766.2. Dr Murray, 10 minutes, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Well, this government never really fails to disappoint in the heights of complacency and self-congratulation to which it aspires. There are really only two themes with the Scottish Government debates. Either we are fantastic or the United Kingdom is rubbish. It's just the ministers who repeat the mantra which actually vary. I am not arguing that nothing has been achieved in the railways. That is patently not true. But the Labour amendment is intended to counteract the rather vain-glorious tenor of this motion and present a reminder of what this government actually hasn't done, the projects it hasn't fully delivered, or it has delivered more slowly than promised, or hasn't actually delivered at all. Importantly, it also serves as a reminder of an opportunity not taken. And that is the opportunity presented by the end of the current ScotRail franchise to discuss more fully what we expect of our railways and to examine whether a different model of delivery could be developed, one which would recycle profits back into rail service improvements rather than into shareholders' pockets. We agree that rail services in Scotland have improved, but there has been we do agree that rail services in Scotland have improved, but that is because there has been a welcome focus in rolling back the damaging effects of the beaching cuts since the Scottish Parliament was reinstated 14 years ago, and this is due to the actions of successive governments supported by members of this Parliament. May 2007 is not year zero, and just because a project was completed during the reign of the SNP doesn't mean to say that its achievement is solely to their credit. For example, the Stirling-Alloa line, reopened in 2008, was enlarged due to investment by Clackmannanshire Council and the Labour-Liberal Scottish Executive of 2003-2007. The Airdrie-Bathgate line was also initiated by that administration, and the Airdrie-Bathgate Railway and Linked Rail Improvements Act was passed in 2007, and the Waverley Railway Scotland Act was passed in 2006. Some improvements have even taken place despite Transport Scotland and Scottish ministers. The electrification of the Paisley Canal line was achieved through an initiative between ScotRail and Network Rail without Transport Rail Scotland's involvement, which is just as well as the Network Rail and ScotRail achieved the upgrade for £12 million, while Transport Scotland estimated it would cost £28 million. And briefly?
Stuart Stephen, briefly.
Will the member take this opportunity to congratulate the young engineer whom I had the privilege of judging at a competition, was the best project of the year, who actually came up with the idea for that, which shows that Scotland has the real engineering initiative to deliver real value in railways.
I'm more than happy to congratulate the young engineer. I just don't particularly want to congratulate the Scottish Government. And then, of course, there are the projects which haven't happened. The Edinburgh Airport Rail Link was scrapped shortly after the SNP took over government in 2007, and the Glasgow Airport Rail Link bit the dust in 2009. Glasgow Crossrail, which would have brought benefit not only to Glasgow, but to rail links to the south west, including Dumfries and my constituency, Ayr and Kilmarnock, was abandoned in 2007, despite having been assessed as presenting a good business case in 2006, and having been about to move to a parliamentary bill. Ironically, Network Rail do intend to electrify this route, but only to enable empty electric stock to access the Shields Road maintenance depot. So doesn't that seem to be a missed opportunity to use investment to achieve additional benefit? And Aberdeen Crossrail was abandoned in the same year.
I thank the member very much for giving way. Would she accept that there's things that we would all like to see in the railways, but I mean, there's the kind of realistic options and then there's the kind of wish list. And would she suggest what she would have cut in order to fund some of these other projects?
Ian Murray.
It was actually in the infrastructure plan, and in fact it had gone as far as being moved to a parliamentary bill, so it was a little bit further than a wish list, I think, at that point. And then there are the projects which have been delayed or deferred. Thanks to debate in Labour time last year, Parliament got the opportunity to discuss the changes to the Edinburgh-Glasgow Improvement Programme, trumpeted and still trumpeted as efficiency savings by the Scottish Government, but in reality a scaling back of the project promised in the SNP manifesto of 2011. Parts of the Edinburgh-Glasgow improvement programme were deferred, as ministers described it. These included the electrification of the Falkirk-Grahamston Loop, the Cumberland, Falkirk-Grangemouth and Stirling-Alloa-Dunblane, which I believe is now coming forward lines, the Dalmeny Curve, which would have linked the Glasgow line directly with the Edinburgh 5 line, the grade-separated junctions at Greenhill and Polmont, and of course there was the earlier scrapping of the Garngan Cord link in 2011. The journey time between Edinburgh and Glasgow on the electrified route will be reduced by only 6 to 8 minutes rather than the promised 13 minutes. And although Transport Scotland and Network Rail protest that there will be no delay in its delivery, others report key obstacles, including the need to close part of the route for 3 months to undertake work on a tunnel, and the requirement to reach a deal with the owners of the Millennium Hotel, part of which will need to be demolished to enable the platforms at Queen Street to be extended. Maybe I'm being a bit cynical, but I am suspicious of the reasons why Transport Scotland's website now contains scant information about the Egypt project or its progress, despite over £70 million having already been spent on Egypt. But it isn't just Egypt. The Perth-Inverness mainline upgrading was originally promised for December 2011, but has now been deferred until 2025. And the Aberdeen-Inverness upgrading was supposed to be scheduled for 2016, but has been deferred till 2030. And the Borders Railway too has been subject to delays, thanks to confusion over its funding mechanism. It is now projected to be up and running by September 2015, 4 years later than planned when improved by MSPs in 2006, following the scrapping of the tender process and the project being handed over to Network Rail for development. And the second part of our amendment highlights the opportunity that the ending of the current ScotRail franchise could have presented for a wider discussion of how our rail services could develop in the future, and for the exploration of how other models of delivery, such as not-for-profit or mutually owned companies, might be developed. Not just now, I'm just going to develop it. When asked by Kenneth McIntosh last week whether the Scottish Government would encourage a not-for-profit bid for the next ScotRail franchise, the Transport Minister stated that on the substantive point, the Railways Act 1993 prevents the Scottish Government from encouraging a public sector bid, and the Minister made the same point again earlier on. However, then he did admit, in answer to Alex Johnson a couple of minutes later, that the legislation he had mentioned specifically prohibits public sector bids, not not-for-profit bids. The Welsh Government, however, are not as timid. They are currently considering the consultation responses to a report written by Professor Paul Solvenson and produced by the cooperative party ASLEF, Cooperative Mutual Wales and Cooperatives UK, in advance of the Wales and Borders contract, which comes up for renewal in 2018. This document actually, in fact, argues that franchising does not work well for railways and instead proposes a not-for-profit enterprise, Rail Cymru, operating as an arm's-length enterprise with the Welsh Government as its principal funder. And instead of hiding behind the Railways Act 1993, the Welsh Transport Minister, Carl Sargent, who now is Minister for Housing and Regeneration, was able to advise the Welsh Assembly during a debate on the 28th of November that he had already raised with the Department for Transport the issue of a fair level playing field for all franchisees, whether they be not for dividend or profit-seeking. There should be a fair opportunity, he said, for people to bid because the upfront costs are sometimes prohibitive for organisations to create the right business case to move forward. He said he had already raised that with the Secretary of State for Transport. So if the Welsh Transport Minister can raise this issue, why is it that the Scottish Transport Minister cannot do the same? Patrick Harvey.
I'm grateful to the member, and I would very much welcome this kind of development. But does the member not accept that in order for a not-for-profit bidder to materialise, what's really needed is government leadership to bring that about, and there is a barrier at present to allowing that support to be given?
I do believe that it needs leadership to make. And what I'm saying is that in Wales, the leadership is being shown. Indeed, the Labour Party at UK level is also looking at a similar document. The Minister made the comment that the state-owned rail companies and other countries could bid for the Scottish franchise. But I'm surprised if he feels badly about that he is not prepared to pursue options to encourage the submission of a mutual and cooperative bid as an alternative to the private sector bids from elsewhere.
Minister.
Can I thank the member for giving me, just to quickly clarify the 3 points I have approached, and I've said a number of times I've approached the Secretary of State for Transport on the issue of changing in terms of the 1983 Act to allow us to open up the bidding process. I've said that we will, of course, look at a not-for-profit trust. I said that to a not-for-profit bid. I said that to Ken McIntosh last week. I just said that we could not encourage one bid over the other, and I've said why we are prevented from having a publicly funded railway bid. Can she say if Ed Miliband agrees to her notion of a publicly funded railway in Scotland, a publicly owned railway in Scotland or the UK?
Honestly, I don't believe it's for Ed Miliband to tell the Scottish Labour Party what it believes. He can look at what he wants for the United Kingdom. Now, I'm not saying that either the model which is being considered by the UK Labour Party or the model which is under consultation in Wales are necessarily correct. But what I think is disappointing is it seems that Scottish ministers seem to have had no interest in having this wider debate. We get prevaricated every time anybody asks a question, as Ken McIntosh did last week. We get prevarication about the 1993 Act, rather than actually a willingness to discuss these issues in more detail. And I would indeed suggest that instead of patting themselves on the back about their achievements, Scottish ministers need to use more imagination in envisaging what a successful future for Scotland's railways might look like.
Many thanks for finishing on time. Herculean effort. Now call on Alex Johnson. 6 minutes, please.
Thank you very much, Deputy Presiding Officer. And lest I forget later in this contribution, may I begin by moving the amendment that stands in my name. It is the case that this government has a record on transport which differs from the government that preceded it. The previous Labour Liberal Democrat administration's reluctance to invest in roads has been corrected, and this SNP government have made the road investments that many thought were required. However, the importance of rail has never been one to be underestimated, and as a result we welcome the opportunity to talk about rail investment and rail services. However, it was with some disappointment that I read the motion that stood in the name of Keith Brown, which did, in my view, seem very self-congratulatory. In fact, claiming in the motion at least many of the successes, which are in fact the successes of Scotland's train franchise holders. And I would like to pay tribute to the work that has been done by the various franchisees in Scotland in order to achieve the significant improvements in the level of passenger satisfaction and performance which now stand as a credit to the system itself. Not at this stage. In fact, I believe that this achievement actually demonstrates the benefits of the existing industry structure. And it is my determination to ensure that we do not make any of the mistakes suggested in the Labour amendment today, which would interfere with a process that would allow the continuation of the effective provision of rail services in Scotland. In fact, the ScotRail franchise is one which I believe is an example of how it can be achieved. Working with government in collaboration, there has been a development of new services and a development of new stations, which genuinely demonstrates the effectiveness of the system that we have before us. The Government, of course, will point out the difficulties associated with the West Coast Main Line franchise, but any criticism of that will perhaps be put to bed when we eventually come to a conclusion on the Clyde and Hebrides Ferries contract, which this Government seems quite determined to drag its feet on over the long term. Nevertheless, there are a number of key issues that I believe are necessary to address during the course of this debate. There is an issue surrounding the balance of contribution between the fare payer and the taxpayer in the provision of public rail services in Scotland. Now, we've heard from the Minister in his opening remarks about the efforts that are being made to keep fares down, and I acknowledge that that policy objective is one which the Minister has pursued and has done so in a quite obvious fashion. Nevertheless, I repeatedly am contacted by people concerned about the figure of £511.5 million mentioned in the Labour Party amendment today, which is the cost of maintaining rail services in Scotland to the public purse. We must keep that balance in mind and remember that we cannot criticise the level of support at a time when the Government is increasing support in order to keep fares down. We cannot criticise both sides without realising that there is a balance to be struck. And while I may at times argue about the nature of that balance, I am not prepared to condemn the level of support at a time when it is obvious why the Government has chosen to increase it. I'd further like to go on and talk to some extent about the efforts that have been made by Scotland's rail operators to produce new services. There is, of course, a number of examples of how profits made by the ScotRail franchise holder have been ploughed back into the provision of new services. In fact, the franchise extension, which took place during the current franchise, is an example of how a deal can be done between government that will take money and investment from the profits of the company back into the provision of services. And I would note that when this was addressed previously in Parliament at the time, that we were in a position on this side to support the action of the government in taking that forward. However, the final thing I would like to address is the key issue that appears in the Labour Party amendment and to some extent is covered by the Green Party amendment as well. And that is the idea that somehow we should find a way to take Scotland's rail industry either partially or totally back into public ownership. I believe that many of the things that have been stated in the Government amendment are a genuine example of how the current system can work. There have been difficulties with the West Coast mainline franchise. There have, of course, been difficulties with the East Coast mainline franchise. But the quality of service they provide is only a credit to those who are providing it. I believe that by ensuring that the current system is properly administered and properly delivered, that at the end of the day we will deliver rail services that will continue to improve, will continue to provide higher levels of passenger satisfaction, will deliver improved performance and, if managed correctly, can deliver better value for money for the taxpayer and the fare payer alike. Only if we persist with the current proposals or the current system can we see these improvements take place. If we fall back into a system that is designed to run on a nationalised or a not-for-profit basis, we run the risk of making all the same mistakes that were made in decades of the past. I invite this government to see sense and ensure that they don't listen to the Labour Party and the Green Party during the course of this debate.
Thanks very much. I now call on Tavish Scott to speak to and move Amendment S4M 06766.3.
Thank you very much, Deputy Presiding Officer. If there's one thing I did agree with Alec Johnson on, it was the complete reversal of policy that happened in 1999. The budget that the Liberal Democrat Labour government at that time inherited was one that was absolutely aimed at roads. It wasn't aimed at rail at all. And we did. We absolutely turned that around. I don't expect current nationalist ministers to ever give that government any credit for, frankly, anything. But I thought that was the most dramatic change that in transport policy that possibly could have happened. And it proved the point of devolution. It proved the point that Scotland could take a completely different route. Now, the Conservatives of the day, I think Murray Tosh was the lead spokesman. I remember him being excoriating in the chamber of Sarah Boyack, who was the first Transport Minister in that administration. I thought Murray Tosh was just plain wrong about that. If we were to make that shift in policy, if we were to make that shift towards a sustainable transport system, then that government did that. That government made that change, and those of us who were around at that time are very proud of that fact. Now, Keith Brown has inherited and taken on, I think, many good initiatives. He's been able to take the credit for opening things that, yes, as Elaine Murray said, were started under previous government. That's the nature of politics. There's no point in being churlish about that. But occasionally it would be nice if our current government did give some credit, even a nudging of credit, to those of us who were brave enough to stand up against the roads lobby and all the rest who said we were completely wrong at that time, and make that switch in policy. Yeah, happy to give way to
Stuart Stevenson.
On the 19th of December 2002, the then Deputy Minister for Enterprise, Transport and Lifelong Learning, Lewis MacDonald, said congestion remains the key challenge facing us, thus putting at the heart of the then Executive's policy roads rather than rail. Is that not indicative of a degree of schizophrenia? That intervention absolutely gives the game away. I was trying to remember what the SNP position was when it came to that big change in policy that we made in terms of budgets. Now, the Conservative position was entirely fair. It was their position. They didn't support it. But the SNP, as I remember, because Kenny McCaskill was the transport spokesman for the Nationalists, seemed to say we were right, and then they all attacked us at a local level. And Stuart Stevens just given the game away, absolutely given away, as usual with the Nationalists. So let's look at their record. Since they want to talk about their record. First, I must pick up Mr Brown and the Minister on his point about ticketing. I applaud his efforts to simplify the system. He's quite right to do that. But he shouldn't claim it all, or maybe it's not him, but certainly the people around him shouldn't claim it all, because as a correspondent in the Scotsman from Kincardineshire said the other day, the ending of the practice of split ticketing
benefits precisely 0.3% of the travelling rail public, and First ScotRail received £2.8 million in additional subsidy from the Transport Minister's Department to cover the downturn in revenue as a result of that split ticketing. So I do hope that when we consider that very sensible move that the Minister is making to try and end that process, we also recognise that it's not without its costs or indeed in terms of the benefits it brings. But I think what does bear some scrutiny in today's transport train world is the record of the government in relation to journey times, because while we can have important debates about how we procure the services, how we franchise. If we don't franchise, do we look at all these other models that Elaine Murray and Patrick Harvey have raised today, and they're quite entitled to do so. What matters most, I suspect, to people travelling is their journey times. And through parliamentary answers, not through anything I've found out, but simply through parliamentary answers I've tabled to this government, we find out that the record, particularly in terms of the North East, is pretty lamentable. In the 2007 to 13 period, that's the period they've been in government, on Glasgow to Edinburgh, Edinburgh to Glasgow, Edinburgh to Aberdeen, Aberdeen to Edinburgh, Inverness to Aberdeen, average journey times have increased, not fallen, increased. So no wonder people in the North East, people in the Highlands are wondering why their government has left them behind on all this rail investment. The economic powerhouse of the Scottish economy, the North East of Scotland, with oil and gas one of the few sectors, sadly, but one of the few sectors of the Scottish and United Kingdom economy that is moving ahead at a rate of knots, should see the rail investment in at least some proportion to what's happening, and cuts in journey times to allow those people in that economy to obtain and to achieve connections to places they need to go. And yet the record, and I'm reading out the government's own statistics from the government's own parliamentary answers, illustrate that the situation has got worse. And Mr Brown, the Transport Minister himself mentioned a cut in 17 minutes. Well, I presume he was referring to the service between Glasgow and Edinburgh and Inverness, because in an answer to a parliamentary question in December, he said that journey times for some services operating between Glasgow and Edinburgh and Inverness would be reduced up to 17 minutes. That was the point he made in his answer. Well, I looked into that. I tabled another question. It turns out that out of the 266 services over 7 days between Glasgow and Edinburgh and Inverness, one service is 18 minutes faster and one service is 17 minutes faster. That's 0.8% of the services. So when the government is congratulating itself and patting itself on the back, I think those figures suggest they've got an awful lot more to do to help people who genuinely want to travel by rail, both to Aberdeen and from Aberdeen, and to and from the Highlands as well. And I thought the Transform Scotland briefing neatly summed up the challenge this government still has to persuade those of us who do believe very strongly in a renaissance in rail. I certainly applaud the Minister's language in this. I certainly applaud his general approach to talking up a golden age of rail, although those figures rather suggest he's got a long way to go. But Transform Scotland said just this week that railways north of the Central Belt remain uncompetitive with roads and are due to worsen. I fear this government has an awful lot more to do.
Many thanks. I now call on Patrick Harvey to speak to and move Amendment S4M 06766.4. Up to 6 minutes, please, Mr Harvey.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. I very much welcome this debate, and I do see positive things to celebrate about the state of our railways, which is why the Green and Independent amendment does not seek to delete the whole of the government's motion. We do part company when it comes to the issue of franchising, because although there may be benefits to the collaborative approach with the industry that the government's motion sets out, we see the possibility of greater benefits from another approach. There's a need for the travelling public to be much more fully involved in future decisions about franchising. Current train operating companies may be private sector profit-seeking businesses, but these are Scotland's railways, public services, and so the public should be centrally involved in setting the priorities. I want all the options to be open for Scotland in restoring a public service ethos to our rail business. We hope, on this side of the chamber, that Scotland will soon take on the powers to change UK legislation and open up new possibilities, which would include Labour's option of a mutual or not-for-profit franchisee, one which, yes, at the moment could bid, but realistically is not going to materialise out of thin air, and I think it needs government support, which at the moment would be inhibited Private sector bidders would be able to oppose such government support for a not-for-profit operator. We, in future, could remove that barrier. We could go further and look again at the whole concept of franchising, or at least permit publicly owned bodies to bid against other competitors. Against a public subsidy of just over £300 million in 2011-12, over £20 million was taken out as profit in the ScotRail franchise. And the Scottish Government, as Alex Johnson has said, is then beholden to a haggling process to see if any of that can be put back into reinvestment. This is a substantial proportion of the public subsidy which we're paying. The ideological obsession with privatisation shows itself in relation to the East Coast franchise as well. We've seen 2 private sector failures. We've seen public sector rescue, followed by broadly successful public sector management. Punctuality is up. Customer satisfaction is at the highest ever level on the line. Over £800 million has been returned to the taxpayer. The state-run East Coast Rail service requires less public subsidy than any of the 15 privately run rail franchises in Britain. That's according to the rail regulator. In April this year, it reported that the net subsidy for East Coast was 1% of the line's income, compared with an average of 32%. Now, bids have been invited by the UK Government, as far as we understand, without reference to the Scottish Government or the interests of the travelling public in Scotland. And I think that's a damning indictment of this ideological obsession with what should be a public service being run for private profit. I did very much welcome the briefing paper from Transform Scotland, and I welcome the Liberal Democrat amendment as well, which makes reference to it. If we want to see rail continue to grow, not as part of a more of everything approach to transport policy, but to reduce car use, which the Minister's motion claims as a priority. If we want to achieve that, there is a real need to ensure that rail services are not only reliable and affordable in absolute terms, but competitive with road journeys in terms of cost and journey times. And the Transform Scotland proposals are of direct relevance to that. There are proposals on the Highland Main Line, for example, cite the Edinburgh to Aberdeen comparison with the Edinburgh to Newcastle comparison. Journeys of roughly the same distance, 124 miles, 130 miles, and yet about 50 minutes of a difference, a 50-minute slower journey on Edinburgh to Aberdeen than roughly the same distance to Newcastle. And as far as their figures on the Perth to Inverness journey times go, we're actually looking at Transform Scotland today said that they might have been a wee bit too conservative in the figures in their briefing, because although the figures they've used based on the AA's figures suggest that the leg from Perth to Inverness should take 2 hours and 33 minutes by car, actually the Scottish Government or Transport Scotland's figures suggest that the journey is typically 90 minutes to 110 minutes for car. And that compares very poorly with the train service that people are enjoying or experiencing at the moment. And the relatively modest investment that would be required in the Highland Main Line in order to improve that and make these services competitive for the future is something that I think we need to prioritise. They've also put forward proposals for the Edinburgh to Perth direct line. Reopening that, reinstating that, would give the chance not only for shorter intercity journeys within Scotland, but it would also free up capacity for improved local services in Fife. Now, notwithstanding Tavish Scott's assertions about the early days of devolution, for years we have seen a heavy emphasis on road investment. You only need to follow the money. Successive Scottish administrations have prioritised road spending. So the M74 was extended, while Glasgow Crossrail plans gathered dust on the shelf. The AWPR was pushed through on spurious cost projections, while the Aberdeen Crossrail suffers the same fate as its Glasgow comparator. Current spending on the A9 and the additional fourth road bridge, of course, are not only resources diverted to road when they could have improved our rail infrastructure, but could lead to a threat to the long-term competitiveness of rail services in the future. In moving the Green Independent Amendment in my name, Deputy Presiding Officer, I urge the Scottish Government to acknowledge not only what's good, but what needs to be much, much better.
Many thanks. We now move to open debate. 6-minute speeches, up to 6 minutes. Mr Stevenson, to be followed by Jenny Mara.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. We've heard a lot of politicians' opinions about Scotland's railways. Let's hear from one or two other people. I happened to meet James Abbott, who's the editor of Modern Railways at Waverley Station on Tuesday this week. It was a fortuitous, not planned meeting. He's up having a look at the improvements that are being made at Waverley and the improvements that there are in Scotland's railways. Rail magazine, about 4 years ago, published a beautifully drawn cartoon of a train in ScotRail livery with the logo ScotRail England, because they thought that if in England the rail services got a little bit of the respect, investment and treatment that they got in Scotland, that would do extremely well south of the border. And only in this month's edition of Rail magazine, in discussing rail fares, the point is made that to the rest of the UK rail network that Scotland is simplifying rail fares via fair fare service. Why can't we have that south of the border? So the objective commentators, quite distinct from us as politicians, are very clear about the achievements that there are in Scotland. And turning to something that Elaine Murray said, she said that it was a great achievement that the £28 million Paisley Canal project was brought in for £12 million, and I absolutely agree with her. But when we improve the costings for taking forward the Egypt project, that somehow is miraculously transformed into a cut, whereas taking £16 million out of Paisley Canal is not. If it's brief, ma'am.
Dr Murray.
I wonder if the member would like to remind us what Rail magazine had to say about the cutbacks to Egypt.
Well, Mr Stevenson.
We can all choose our quotes, and let me just give you a quote from Ian Gray when he was Transport Minister. Ian Gray promised us that nobody, not 95%, nobody in Scotland would have to stand anywhere in the ScotRail network for more than 10 minutes. Don't think that's either possible, practical, but it was one of these promises that the Labour Party made, which I've yet to see the faintest glimmer of delivery. Now, Tavish Scott quite reasonably focused on journey times, and I think it's a good point to focus on, because I think we'll all recognise and share the understanding that there is a tension between how many stops you make in a journey and the journey times. And that's why it's a little invidious to compare journey times between Edinburgh and Aberdeen and Edinburgh and Newcastle. Similar distance, but very different stopping patterns. But in the case of Tavish Scott, he's talking about journey times to Aberdeen and quoting averages. Now, they may all be correct, but they conceal something very important. If we're to look at the median times, what actually has happened is there are more trains, more of them stop in Fife, but most of the ones from Aberdeen to Edinburgh stop hardly at all in Fife. So, therefore, the availability to people in Aberdeen of faster journeys to Edinburgh has substantially increased compared to where it was before, while simultaneously we have additional stops in Fife that increase access to rail. I can see Mr Scott wishes to come in.
Well, to Mr Stevens giving way, I take his point, but I was simply quoting the government's own figures on average journey times. And I also looked at the SNP's manifesto from 2011, a document I'm sure he's entirely familiar with, which says our proposals will also mean faster, more frequent connections between Inverness, Aberdeen and between those cities in the Central Belt. Didn't happen with the figures I used.
I simply return to the point that he's correct about average times, but median times would be a better way of looking at it, because we've introduced more fast journeys between Aberdeen and Edinburgh. And I think that's the point. You only get the answer to the question you ask. Sometimes you have to modify the question to understand what's actually going on. Now, let's just talk about rail fares. I have to say one of the great benefits of old age, and there aren't very many of them, is having access to the senior rail card. It's £30 a year and an enormous bargain. That, coupled with Office and ScotRail, have meant, for example, that this week my return journey, Huntly to the south, is a mere £17, provided I go off-peak, of course. So that's very good. And there are many, many opportunities for people to do that. Looking at the fare structure is important. I have been advised, for example, when travelling from Keith to Inverness, to actually buy a ticket to Muir of Ord, which is beyond Inverness because it's cheaper. That's the sort of anomaly which we will continue, I hope, to work on. Aberdeen to Inverness. Well, it's worth looking at what's happened at Inverurie. Great proportion of the trains that previously stopped at Dice now continue to Inverurie. We're now actually paying the penalty for success because it's driven patronage up at Inverurie. We now have the longest operational train anywhere in the ScotRail network, a 7-carriage train running between Aberdeen and Inverness. That's a part of the network that is important to my constituents and to others, but it's a part which is in... I'm now out of time, sorry. And let me just finally congratulate the Scottish Government on the introduction of Wi-Fi. I personally am finding it highly useful. I see in my daily commute dozens of people each carriage using the Wi-Fi.
You should be closing
Congratulate
now,
everything the Minister and the Government have done. Presiding Officer.
Many thanks. Now calling Jenny Mara to be followed by John Mason. Up to 6 minutes, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. The point I was going to put to Stuart Stevenson is I am very glad to hear that he feels that the anomalies, the remaining anomalies, should be sorted out on the railways, and maybe we'll get the chance later in the debate to hear whether he thinks they should be sorted out this franchise or if they have to wait till the next franchise, as the Scottish Government have indicated. Because nearly 2 months ago, the Scottish Government answered Labour's calls to end the Tay tax for Dundonians by pledging to lower the cost of 275,000 rail journeys in and out of the city. My campaign to end the Tay tax began in July 2011. For years, Dundonians were unfairly penalised at the train station simply because they did not live in the central belt inside the government subsidised zone. On journeys to Edinburgh, Glasgow and Aberdeen, it was cheaper for Dundonians to split their tickets across different legs of a journey to make a modest saving. And at New Year this year, a return fare from Dundee to Glasgow hit £50.50, making it cheaper for 4 people travelling from Dundee to Glasgow to take a taxi there and back. Yes.
Stuart Stevenson.
Is the member aware that the advance fare bought by 6 o'clock yesterday evening to Dundee at peak time is less than £15?
Mara.
Yes, I am aware of the myriad of fares across our system and the fact that they are incomprehensible and that the Government has made some moves to sort out the anomalies, but there are still many existing anomalies which I'm coming on to. Because it's been exactly 2 weeks now since lower fares kicked in, and I am pleased to say that many Dundonians are benefiting, but not all. Some are still being hit with the Tay tax, the one we wanted to abolish. And I want to ask the Government today if they will finish the job they started at Easter and commit to ending all rail fare anomalies for Dundee within this franchise. Because it is still cheaper to buy a return ticket from Dundee to Lookers at £7.80 and a return ticket from Lookers to Edinburgh at £23.20 than it is to buy a direct return from Dundee to Edinburgh at £31.40. This is 40p more expensive to travel directly. Not much, you might say, but it makes no sense at all, and this is my point. The cost per mile between Dundee and Lookers over the Tay Bridge is far higher than the journey from Lookers to Edinburgh per mile. Now, why is this when Alex Salmond said that he would sort out the Tay tax? Travelling from Edinburgh to Dundee, the last 14 minutes of your journey home across the beautiful Tay puts your fare up by 35%. A beautiful view. I'm sure the Transport Minister will agree with me, but you have to pay through the nose for it still after his intervention at Easter. And it is cheaper, I am told, to travel first class from Lookers to Edinburgh than it is to travel the longer journey in standard class from Dundee to the capital city. Now, yes.
Harvey?
I share the member's frustration. Does she recognise that it's a situation that applies in many other parts of the country as well? And I say this with a little irritation, having been stung for £12 for the convenience of a single ticket between my home and the centre of Glasgow recently on the way to Perth.
Yes, I would agree with the member that there are anomalies across the country, but he will forgive me for coming back to my pet topic and talking about the situation facing my home city. Now, I welcome the alterations that Alex Salmond made in fares at Easter, and I said that. And I'm glad he listened to our campaign and made commuters' lives a bit easier. But I'm asking the Transport Minister today to consider this. Dundee to Edinburgh is a well-used commuting route. The rail subsidies are designed to encourage business and investment. That's what the subsidised zone is for. Many people travel from Dundee to Edinburgh for business and work purposes. And when the new Malmaison opens on our waterfront this autumn, we will want to make it attractive for visitors and potential investors in our city from Edinburgh as well as Glasgow. We can't wait until the next franchise to tee up these investment opportunities for our important waterfront project. So I'm asking the Transport Minister today. He has sorted the Clyde tax and the Don tax from Dundee. Will he now be true to his pledge and abolish the iniquitous Tay tax for my city once and for all?
Thank you very much. I now call on John Mason to be followed by Claudia Beamish.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. It seems fair to me on these occasions that both we comment on the situation as we have it at present and also to express some hopes for the future, and I would like to do both of these today. We've had two useful recent receptions at Holyrood, one being from the Office of Rail Regulation and the second from Virgin on Tuesday, and I do thank both of them for an opportunity to have extremely interesting discussions with a number of experts. And it reminded me, or there was a reminder at one of these, at the Virgin one, that there was a suggestion not that long ago that the only railways in Scotland would be between Glasgow and Edinburgh and between each city and London. So when you think of what might have happened, we can be extremely positive about where we are today, and facts like the fact that ScotRail have 83.2 million passengers in 2012-13. But it's not only that there have not been these closures that were suggested at one stage, but we've seen some real steps forward. I think members will not be surprised that I mentioned the Airdrie-Bathgate line, which is my favourite railway line, obviously. And I do accept, based on the points that were made earlier, that legislation was done under a previous administration and the final funding decision, I understand, was made under the present government. So, absolutely, it's a combination of the two. And that link has meant that from the east end of Glasgow to Edinburgh, but also further west from Mulgai, from Helensburgh, have a direct route through to the capital. Even more local for myself as the constituency is Dalmarnock Station, which is to be the main station for the Commonwealth Games. It was a very run-down and poorly used station. It now has had £11 million, I think, refurbishment spent on it, and has recently reopened, although the building itself is not quite finished. And if I picked up the Minister correctly today, he's stating that the electrification of the Whifflet line is being sped up, which is tremendous as well, including 3 stations in my constituency, namely Carmyle, Mount Vernon and Baillieston. But on a wider scale, perhaps one of the best improvements, I think, in the railways over recent years has been much better information being available to passengers. And I do say passengers, I don't like the customer word. Even as a relatively small station like mine at Garrahill, we have screens now on both platforms showing the next 3 trains, the estimated times of arrival and any major announcements like storm damage or flooding. On top of that, we have announcements over the public address system, and that is so much better than it used to be. On the trains itself, I think the announcements do vary a bit, and some drivers volunteer a lot more information than others, but there's no question there's been an improvement over recent years. Now, clearly a lot of today's debate will be about future projects, things that we would like to happen, and I do think that we can split these into 3 categories. There's those beginning to happen now, like Egypt or the Borders line. There's the high priorities for the future, but there's also the wish list, which, frankly, we all have. We have our pet projects that, if we had pots of money, we would like to see as well. On the projects that are actually beginning to happen, I have to say I drove down to Galashiels recently to take part in a meeting with Murdo Fraser, And it was the first time, I have to confess, I'd been down that way for a while, and I was hugely impressed driving down the road. And it seemed like every few hundred metres there was a sign about the work going on the railway and the access to the work sites. And it's very clear to me that quite a dramatic amount of work is going on there. If I can mention just a few improvements that I would like to see going forward, certainly very much welcome the electrification into Queen Street, high level. And we also had the Jacobs report, which came out, I think, just about the same time as we were debating this last time, and so we hadn't really had time to look at it properly. But I certainly welcome the idea of longer platforms at Queen Street, which would allow 4 8-car trains per hour, rather than the 6 6-car trains, which had originally been suggested, but would have meant a lot more complex signalling and all the rest of it. And as has been said by one of my colleagues, if the same result can be produced for a lower amount of money, that is surely a success. I would be interested if the Minister could give us an update about the timescales for the work at Queen Street. More through trains has been a theme which I think for a number of years has been seen to be a good thing to take pressure off city centre termini. Already we've mentioned Helensburgh to Edinburgh via the Queen Street low level, and of course previously the Argyll line was reopened, giving routes from Lanarkshire to Dumbartonshire via Glasgow Central low level. So the next obvious through route would, it seems to me, be from Ayrshire and Renfrewshire, which I believe includes Paisley, for Mr Adams' information, and straight through via Crossrail to Edinburgh using an existing line. Now, for those not familiar with that, that's lines that used to serve St Enoch's Station in Glasgow. They are currently in use, they are available, but are not electrified. And for relatively little cost, the 1.8 miles could be electrified. I accept it would be more expensive in the longer term to put in a station at Glasgow Cross, but that would also have a tremendous economic impact on the inner East End of Glasgow. I have a few other pet projects, like a station at Parkhead on the Airdrie-Bathgate line. And if I could mention ticketing as well, which has been mentioned already. I think it was maybe in the same letter that Tavish Scott was reading from the Scotsman, where it went on to talk about triangular journeys, and that's a particular interest of mine. Sometimes I would go, say, Glasgow, Perth, Edinburgh and back to Glasgow in the one day, and there seems to be no way of coping with that within the system. Similarly, many of us travel to Edinburgh 3 times a week, but cannot get vouchers, have to pay cash every day on the train. But more widely too, people say to me the bus is cheaper than the train, and I think that's something we need to look at. So in conclusion, I have to say I'm very enthusiastic about rail. Of course we have our wish list of what we want to see, but we have to accept there's been huge improvements in recent years. Thank you.
Excellent. Thanks very much. Now calling Claudia Beamish, to be followed by Dennis Robertson. Up to 6 minutes, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I want to focus on some of the rail developments in South Scotland today and hopefully draw some Scotland-wide conclusions. The developing success story of Carstairs Station, fought over for many years by the Clydesdale Rail Action Group and many others, is testament to their tenacity. Now there are 2 hourly trains through the day, and the station is really being used again very quickly, to the extent that a car park feasibility study is being undertaken. There are other successes, of course, beyond expectation, of other new rail ventures, from new stations to lines opening. However, at a recent Office of Rail Regulation presentation, I was concerned to identify what I see as a gap or lack of balance in priorities by the Scottish Government in relation to people connectivity. The ORR stressed that, and I quote, under the heading of journey times, that Scottish ministers have made it clear to us that fast and efficient rail services across Scotland and between Scotland and the rest of the UK and beyond are vital to opening up new markets and business opportunities, driving up competitiveness and increasing access to employment. And thus, the ORR states, we will be asking Network Rail to develop a process to identify opportunities for journey time improvement. Of course, speed is necessary, not least as highlighted by Transform Scotland, because rail has to compete with road. However, the ORR presentation failed to even mention another ministerial priority, one highlighted today and in the Scottish Minister's high-level output specification. One of the commitments is to deliver rail services, and I quote again, which support our businesses and communities by connecting towns, cities and, I emphasise, this is my emphasis, and rural areas. Fast journeys, Minister, are only good for those who are already on the train. How can the potential conflict between these two ministerial priorities be evaluated if one of these is not highlighted in the periodic review for the CP5? Can I ask the Minister to reassure the Chamber about this concern in his closing remarks? Yeah.
Minister Keith Brown.
The member for taking intervention. Just say one way in which you can reconcile those two things is, for example, the commitment we made to the new high-speed line between Edinburgh and Glasgow. But when that's established, what it will mean that the other 4 lines can then be much more accessible to other stations opening up. And journey time, if it's important to people, they can use the very fastest link, but other people will have the opportunity to use the other links. That's the way they can both things can work together: journey time improvements and more accessibility.
I understand what the Minister is saying, but the point I'm making is that if it's not in CP5, that other priority of people cannot connectivity, then there is a cause for concern. The work of the Cooperative Party, SERA and ASLEF in Wales, as highlighted by other members, for a People's Railway for Wales, and I commend this document to everybody in the Chamber, is really significant. And in the new franchising process, although I've listened to the arguments and concerns, I do hope that the Minister will push forward on this as a consideration. It would lead to a new kind of railway company, I quote, whose main commitment would be to the people and not to a group of shareholders. Its values would reflect the wider social mission, and it would aim to set new standards of customer service and community benefit. To succeed as being regarded as an outstanding social enterprise, full involvement of its employees would be essential, and also there would be close and positive relationships with local authorities and their regional consortia, and it would also build on the outstanding work in Wales of the Welsh Community Rail Partnerships, which I understand the Minister is interested in for Scotland as well, and station friends groups, to ensure that it will be strongly focused on local communities it serves. An interesting document indeed, which I commend to the Chamber. Of course, the debate entitled Transforming Scotland's Railways would not be complete without making further reference to the long-awaited Borders Rail project. I'm pleased to hear that Network Rail has arranged a number of community drop-in sessions to get the views of local people, and this is indeed the way forward. Also tomorrow, the Scottish Borders Tourism Partnership are hosting a conference at Tweed Horizons, which will explore how tourism opportunities from Borders Rail can be utilised. I would like to acknowledge the Minister's sensible, if I may say so, adjustment to Borders Rail spec in relation to the charter trains, but hope he will look again at the possibility of Saturday trains, which is a big concern. And in the longer term, the Campaign for Borders Rail has asked me to raise the issue of the line itself, again going beyond to Hoyk and, in the long-distant future, possibly to Carlisle. Another regeneration issue intimately connected with rail is that of Stranraer, and the concerns about busing people from Cairnryan to Glasgow is a real worry for people there, and the dilapidated state of the station. And the Community Rail Partnership there is keen to meet with the Minister, and I wonder if he might respond to my request for the Community Rail Partnership in SALSA to meet with him. I've also, on a more general point in relation to tourism, can I ask the Minister to let the Chamber know if more provision will be made for taking bikes on trains in the future? And there's an issue I'd like to raise on behalf of my colleague, Dr Simpson, which is about the continuing health impacts of night freight trains in the Minister's constituency. And I know this is something that he's looking into, but surely the Minister can ask the Chief Medical Officer to at least study the effects on households affected and consider mitigation measures.
Drawing to a close, please.
Thank you. In relation to climate change, I would like to praise ScotRail's steps to lessen our impact on the environment, which are encouraging, but there's much more to do if we are to enable people to get onto the train and off roads where they can. And
that's fine. Thanks very much. Now call on Dennis Robertson, to be followed by Margaret McCulloch.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I shall take on board your opening remarks and do my best to stay on time and, of course, on track. Oh dear, it gets worse. Presiding Officer, my constituents have got much to be pleased about with the improvements that are being projected for the North East of Scotland. Within my own constituency, we are delighted to have confirmation that Kintore Station will at last be opened once again and is subject to be opened by 2019.
Alison McInnes.
I am indeed pleased that the Government has finally agreed to our campaign for reopening Kintore railway station. But does Mr Robertson not agree with me that it would be much more ambitious to have it open sooner? That waiting for it until 2019 is far too long to wait.
Dennis Robertson.
I'm glad that Alison McInnes believes that her campaign and her campaign alone was the reason for this station being opened. I think not. I think there is cause for celebration in terms of opening the station, and much work needs to be done to ensure that the station is opened and indeed is providing the best link for not just between Aberdeen and Kintore, but between Aberdeen and Inverness. And I'm sure the member is aware of that fact. Again, within my own constituency, Inch Station will look forward to the Step 3 accessibility for that particular station and the additional car parking facilities. And it's my understanding that the discussion between Network Rail and the landowner is going well, and we look forward to having a conclusion on those discussions and, as I say, the improved service for the constituents of Inch. Both Kintore and Inch will give the opportunity, Presiding Officer, for much more car drivers to leave their cars at their local stations and to travel into their city and certainly beyond. As a non-car driver myself, and I'm sure that's great relief to many here, I am a regular. I take the train on a regular basis from my home station from Stonehaven to Edinburgh on a weekly basis. And certainly on these journeys, I'm becoming more aware of the increased number of passengers using their laptops on the train, just like myself. And with the inclusion of the Wi-Fi service, it's certainly making my job much easier with regard to that connectivity. However, we must acknowledge that there are certain black spots on the line, no fault of our Scot and no fault of this government. Presiding Officer, I hear the cry for better train journey times, and I accept that. However, we've got to take cognizance of the fact that not everyone lives in the major cities, and sometimes we do rely on the trains stopping at the intermediate stations. I mentioned that my hometown of Stonehaven is the station I use, and certainly I appreciate the fact that with the new timetabling schedules there are more trains stopping at Stonehaven. However, I do feel that if we look at just beyond the peripheral aspect of our cities, we sometimes need to be a bit more imaginative if we want more car drivers to leave their cars at home and take that last few miles, perhaps 20 miles, into the city centre. So I would urge First Scot to look at their timetabling schedules to see if it is indeed possible to have more trains stopping at the likes of Stonehaven and indeed Inverurie. And in fact, perhaps be more imaginative when it comes to the franchise, and perhaps this is something maybe the Minister could discuss with First Scot or any other provider, to look at perhaps even having a shuttle service when it's not the express train running from, say, Aberdeen to Edinburgh or Aberdeen to Glasgow, that there could be a shuttle service for the commuters going from Stonehaven to Inverurie. Again, a fantastic opportunity for more people leaving their cars at their home station and providing, as I say, better connectivity for the passengers in those areas. Presiding Officer, the journey from Stonehaven to Edinburgh is just over 2 hours. And it's not a long journey as such. However, can I say it is much more comfortable when I take the East Coast train or the cross-country train. First Scot, I think, need to look at their comfort aspect of their passengers. And I know this is something that could be looked at within the franchise for 2015.
1 minute, please.
Thank you. Because I think it is important when we're trying to encourage people onto the rail services to try and not just cut down times, but certainly to improve the comfort for our passengers on those journeys. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I now call on Margaret McCulloch to be followed by Graham Day. Up to 6 minutes, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I welcome this opportunity to speak on the subject of Scotland's railways and to underline the importance of a rail infrastructure to our economy, our communities and our potential as a nation. Scotland's rail network is a tremendous asset, and it is an asset I believe we can get much more out of than we do at present. To me, the most underdeveloped part of the rail network, at least outside of major cities, would be our local train stations. I would acknowledge station improvements achieved through the Scottish Government, Network Rail, SPT, First ScotRail and others. In my own region, I can think of plenty of examples of new car parkings, new shelters, new signage and new toilet facilities, but we're still not realising the full potential of our train stations. And I know that the Minister is aware of the Adopt a Station programme and the difference it has made to communities the length and breadth of Scotland. Through Adopt a Station, volunteers or start-ups commit to sprucing up their local train stations, often with flowers or artwork, but also with more ambitious landscaping and outdoor projects. There are more successful examples of communities adopting stations than I could possibly name this afternoon, but I would like to draw particular attention to South Lanarkshire College, Crosshouse Primary School in East Kilbride and Hamilton Grammar, and the staff and patients of NHS Lanarkshire Beckford Lodge. But while the efforts of volunteers are welcome, there is a strategic importance to our rail stations that could be developed further. Growing the tourism trade, promoting active travel, regenerating town centres, good train stations can support the priorities of government at both a local and a national level. Every train station is a gateway to a community and a crucial transport link, not just part of the rail network, but part of a bus route or a local road or a cycle trail. We should use our stations and our rail services to sell Scotland and sell destinations within Scotland to businesses, tourists and our own people too. I would also stress the benefits to the economy of sustained capital investment in infrastructure. In my own area, improvements to the Greater Glasgow suburban network would not only reduce journey times, but would also create opportunities for people to work and to train, all of which helps support growth. We have been waiting for some time for the electrification of the East Kilbride line, and I am concerned that the knock-on effect of last year's Egypt's cuts is that we will be waiting even longer. Scotland's towns need reliable connections to Scotland's cities, and so I want to emphasise to the whole Chamber the importance of upgrading the rail network in those areas. Finally, Presiding Officer, I want to focus on the needs and the experiences of passengers, which Passenger Focus, Transport Scotland and others have set out to the ICI Committee in evidence over a period of several months. The report, Designing the Future, looked at the design of rail carriages and found that the requirements of Scottish passengers included safety, ease of access, comfort, luggage space and general cleanliness. Peak time travellers also emphasised their concerns about overcrowding and the capacity of our trains to cope during busy periods. Looking beyond rolling stock and design issues, I am sure we all understand the importance of accessibility, multimodal transport links, reduced journey times and good Wi-Fi coverage. And I hope that all those who bid for the ScotRail franchise will understand the breadth of the passenger's experience. It's not just about getting on or off a train, it's about booking tickets, planning a journey, spending time in a station, and it's increasingly about comparing trains with cars. Presiding Officer, I don't doubt that there is good work happening in our railways. I have seen plenty of examples of it for myself. But we have to raise our game to make sure that our rail network is in its entirety improves and will one day rank amongst the best in the world. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Now Colin Graham-Day to be followed by Murdo Fraser. Up to 6 minutes, please.
Thank you. Presiding Officer, regardless of who deserves the credit, rail is, as the Minister said, a success story in Scotland. The passenger numbers of ScotRail, which manages 95% of train services here, more than 750,000 journeys all told, continues to rise, 33% up in 9 years, and 2013 being 2.6% up on 2012. Whether it be to get to work, education or for leisure purposes, more and more Scots are letting the train take the strain, as the old slogan said. And just as the number of services being provided is rising, so passenger satisfaction levels are high. But we must build on this, and I want to look to the future. I welcome the commitment of the Government through Phase 1 of HLOS to deliver extra commuter services through a programme which runs until 2019. And from a perhaps more parochial perspective, I welcome even more warmly proposals being looked at for the control periods 5, which is 2014 to 2019, and 6, 2019 to 24, which would have direct impact on my own constituency. Within control period 5, I understand that a number of track and signalling works are being considered, which would improve capacity between Aberdeen and the Central Belt. And I look forward to the outcome of the feasibility study into this, which I believe is expected to be completed by the end of this year. And within control period 6 in the Aberdeen to Central Belt Rail Enhancement Scheme, we have the prospect of further enhanced signalling and, more significantly, doubling the track section at Usan, a move with a significant price tag, but one which rail experts tell us would have the potential to greatly enhance rail provision down the East Coast and, of course, through Angus. There has already been welcome investment in rail provision through my own constituency, and with more to come over the next decade. We are very much on the right track as far as getting more and more Angus residents out of their cars and onto trains, although I think we will only fully realise the potential of this with a change in emphasis, which I'll come to in a moment. The recently delivered additional weekend services, which are benefiting both Arbroath and Carnoustie, are good news for commuters, as is the fact Carnoustie now has facilities from which prepaid tickets can be collected, affording locals the opportunity to make advanced money-saving purchases, and I want to return to this subject a little later also. It has also, in the past few months, had installed new platform seating, and although in good nick, considering the ravages that sea air can inflict on metalwork, it's in line for provision of signage, paintworks and rebranding later this year as well. I further welcome the fact that we will shortly have Wi-Fi available on many of the trains serving the Angus route, although, as the Minister knows, I have raised with him the issue of Carnoustie being omitted from the first tranche of in-station Wi-Fi provision. And none of the Angus stations may tick the footfall and time spent in location boxes, which were criteria for the initial deployment, but Carnoustie is hosting a Commonwealth Games event, which was another. But achieving a transformational change isn't just about infrastructure and service delivery. I would argue, Presiding Officer, that we as service users also have to change the way in which we approach utilising and accessing our railways if we are to derive the full benefit from them. It really is surprising, for example, that in this day and age, 75% of ScotRail's custom remains walk-up. We buy our food shopping and our white goods, and we book our holidays to far-flung places online. Yet, when it comes to purchasing a ticket for a train, we still wander up to the station and pay top dollar. Go online and there aren't just savings to be made. You can also reserve a seat on many services with a click of the mouse, ensuring there is no need to make the journey standing up. And these... Absolutely.
I thank the member for taking an intervention on that point. With regard to seat reservations, would a member accept that one of the confusing things for passengers, and especially with First ScotRail trains, is they're not terribly sure which carriage they're going to. So better signage on the carriages would enable passengers who have reserved their tickets and their seats to go to the right carriage.
It's a very valid point made by my colleague. But I would make the point that these savings can be significant. From personal experience, booking online can save up to 13% in the cost of a standard return from Angus to Parliament. And a recent journey to and from Parliament involving a detour via Glasgow, albeit interestingly for a meeting with a rail service provider, it was made for 25% less than I would have paid it on the day. And unlike Stuart Stevenson, I don't have possession of a senior citizen rail card. According to ScotRail, by booking a specified Aberdeen to Edinburgh train on or off peak in advance, you can save up to £36.90 on the walk-up and go fare. Now, of course, not everyone has access to the internet, but most do. And I ask why we wouldn't act in a way that's beneficial to the pocket and helps rail providers to better gauge just how many carriages may be required on particularly popular services. More importantly, though, Presiding Officer, I would argue that we need to strike a balance in what we demand of our rail services. We are each of us guilty of casting our eye down the timetable to see just how long it will take to get us from our starting point to our intended destination. But as we strive as a society to behave in an increasingly environmentally responsible manner, I pose the question, what is rail transportation actually meant to deliver? Is it only to get us from point A to point B as quickly as possible, or to get as many people on board, as it were, therefore reducing the use of private vehicles, in which case fitting in as many stops as possible along the route, or having more linking in services without creating havoc with a timetable, must surely be an increasingly important consideration. There's a balance to be struck there, I accept that, but out with the Central Belt, you will only get more people on the trains if the trains are stopping locally or the connections are in place to take passengers into central points for city-to-city transfers, which, to be fair, does seem to be the direction of travel we're on. If you live in Arbroath or Carnoustie, in my constituency, then you have good access to rail services. In the case of Montefieth, however, there are just 2 trains a day stopping there, and then only on weekdays. I'm hopeful that the very positive dialogue I've been involved in with ScotRail will lead before long to an improvement in that situation, and I would commend all those engaged in this process for the solution-seeking approach that has been adopted. But the Monteith case highlights for me the need to transform our thinking about rail, to tolerate sometimes slightly extended journey times because there's more traffic on the rails linking in small towns, or more stops being made in order to ensure more of us fellow citizens can get on the train and in so doing reduce Scotland's carbon footprint.
Thank you very much. Call Murdo Fraser, to be followed by Bruce Crawford.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. It's been an interesting debate so far, although rather like Elaine Murray, I regret the rather self-congratulatory tone of the Government's motion, because the reality for many people in Scotland is somewhat different. I'm sure the Transport Minister has seen the popular film franchise Back to the Future. That is exactly what some passengers are experiencing in Scotland's railways today. Because if I were travelling between Perth and Edinburgh in 1913, I would arrive sooner than the passenger making that same journey today. If I was standing on the platform at Edinburgh Waverley in 1895, getting a train to Dundee, I would arrive in Dundee at least 5 minutes quicker than I would if I made that same journey this afternoon. This is 21st century Scotland, and we need 21st century rail links. There's a very good case to be made for high-speed rail, Deputy Presiding Officer, but it would be a start to have rail travel matching the standards of the Victorians. Now, the Scottish Government should bridge the gap between the standard of rail links offered in the Central Belt, which can be very good, and those serving much of the rest of Scotland. Because if the country is open for business, efficient rail services are critical in ensuring we make the most of our economic opportunities. For example, Aberdeen is emerging as the employment capital of Britain, with 2 jobs to every 1 job seeker. Yet, as we have heard, travel between Edinburgh and Aberdeen takes 50 minutes longer than the journey between Edinburgh and Newcastle, which is 6 miles longer in distance. And increasing the connectivity. No, not on that point. I've had a long discussion on that particular point, Mr Stevens. I'd like to move on and develop other issues, if I may. And I think increasing the connectivity between our major cities will encourage businesses to relocate from the Central Belt into the more peripheral areas, Perth, Aberdeen, Dundee and Inverness. So I make no apology for concentrating my remarks on the Perth to Edinburgh rail service. And here I find myself in the unusual position of agreeing with much of what Patrick Harvey had to say this afternoon. I do not agree with Patrick Harvey on the question of nationalisation of the railways. I am old enough to remember British Rail. I am even old enough to remember the British Rail sandwich, which I'm sure a few of those I had in my time, and I do not think we should go back to those days. And those who travel on the rails will have seen dramatic improvements in the intervening period. But where I do agree is there is a need for better connectivity between our cities, and that applies to Scotland's newest city, which is Perth. So whether it's digital infrastructure or speedier rail links, we should be making that a better place to do business. As the gateway to the Highlands, Perth is perfectly situated to take full advantage of a variety of economic opportunities, and yet, as I said, rail journeys between Perth and Edinburgh are slower today than they were before the First World War. By no stretch of the imagination can this be progress. Yes, of course.
Bruce Crawford.
I think, though, you've got to recognise, Murdo Fraser, that Richard Beeching's cut with the particular line-up we went up through Kinross had a significant impact in terms of the journey times issue.
Murdo Fraser.
I entirely agree with Mr Crawford, and I thank him for that helpful introduction. I'm about to come to my solution to that very problem that he proposes, because a direct rail link between Perth and Inverkeithing was mooted in relation to the 2008 Strategic Transport Projects Review, but there were significant financial and engineering hurdles in its way. And an amended plan put forward, as Patrick Harvey said, by Transform Scotland for an intercity express to link Perth to Holbeath would have the potential to reduce journey times to Edinburgh by 35 minutes and would be less costly than the originally proposed plan, because it would avoid the need for expensive tunnelling between Holbeath and Inverkeithing. And this, of course, would have a knock-on reduction in journey times to Inverness and the north. And indeed, trains up the east coast to Aberdeen could be rerouted via Perth rather than taking the journey through Fife, with a consequent time saving. Now, clearly there would be a capital cost to this plan, but as with any large-scale infrastructure project, economies of scale could help reduce these costs. And utilising the expertise used to construct the new Borders Railway that John Mason referred to could also help decrease costs substantially. So I would like to see this project considered for the Scottish Government's third national performance framework. Yes, of course.
Minister.
Murdo Fraser for taking intervention, and he's mentioned the Transform Scotland proposal. Transform Scotland also say that the spokesperson said to me, well, I don't think there's any shortage of money, and they also say this would be around about £1 billion. Have you any idea where he would find this money from for this project?
Murdo Fraser, and you're approaching your last minute.
Thank you, President Officer. Well, of course, these forward plans are for the long term. I'm not suggesting we should start doing this work tomorrow or even next year, but planning ahead Scotland's infrastructure for 10 or 20 years' time, this is the sort of project that we should be looking and seriously costing to see whether it is viable because of the advantages. Let me just, in the moments remaining, Presiding Officer, turn my attention further north. I'm not surprised that the Greens, in their amendment, oppose the dualling of the A9. I'm disappointed that we have Highland MSPs who appear to be doing that. I don't think it's an either-or, dualling the A9 or improving the Highland mainline rail service. Back in 2008, the First Minister stood up at the SNP conference in Inverness and committed his government to improving, by 2012, the journey time between Inverness and Edinburgh by 35 minutes. Well, it's not happened, Presiding Officer. It's 2013, it's still single track, it's still not electrified, and it still takes longer than he promised. So when will the SNP honour the pledges they made to the people of the Highlands and actually improve the Highland mainline service? Presiding Officer, Scotland deserves a first-class rail network, not the second-class ticket offered by the SNP.
Thank you very much. Bruce Crawford, to be followed by Dave Thompson.
Presiding Officer, the aim of any railway industry must be to place the railway at the centre of a transport system that helps to drive economic growth. Now, that's easy to say, but the challenges of providing capacity to drive that economic growth while at the same time improving safety, reducing carbon emissions, delivering better value for money for the passenger, and cutting the level of public service in a very complex industry cannot be underestimated. The challenge means that all of those who are involved in the rail industry in Scotland, whether it's government, Transport Scotland, Network Rail, as well as contractors, exploring new ways to deliver greater efficiencies and generate more revenue. And that challenge is exemplified by the fact that Scottish towns and cities have changed significantly since the regrettable public transport policies of Richard Beeching in the 1960s. And how people use public transports, the distances they travel, and what they expect from their journey is also very different. In terms of rail passengers, as others have noted, they are at record levels on a network that's half the size of what it was pre-Beeching. Now, this is to be celebrated, but I think it's true to say that overcrowded trains, peak time congestion and little space capacity in the network is evidence that the railway system is perhaps a victim of its own success. But that's why I'm delighted that the Government are so committed to the Edinburgh and Glasgow Improvement Programme. Let me tell you why. This programme represents one of the most significant investments ever made in Scotland's rail infrastructure, and its aim is to address the capacity issue I mentioned earlier. It is the wholesale electrification extending right across the Central Belt that is the key to unlocking additional capacity, reducing congestion and ensuring longer trains means more seats for more passengers. Certainly.
Gavin Brown.
I'm grateful to the member for giving way. Does he accept, though, that what we are now getting with Egypt is less than what was promised?
Bruce Crawford.
Some of us live in the Holyrood bubble, and some of us live in the real world of actually what's going on in terms of the economy and the impact of the reduction in public services brought about by the UK Government. I just wish sometimes the Tories would reflect on that in some of the comments we make. Inevitably, programmes have to be adjusted to take consideration of the real world. But there is significant work already going on this programme. I want to come to that, because we all sit in here in the Holyrood bubble, but actually out there are some real things happening on Egypt. Getting that Central Belt right, though, will also provide solid foundation for improvements to the line to Perth, Inverness, Fife and the North East. Stirling, in my own constituency, will also benefit from faster journey times, both to Edinburgh and Glasgow, with more reliable and resilient train services and quieter, greener trains. Unfortunately, projects on this scale do not come without some disruption. Let me give you an example of what I mean from the Stirling area. Faced with the significant constraints of Victorian infrastructure, Network Rail has already embarked upon a programme as part of Egypt of clearance works, ensuring bridges are high enough for the rails to run electric cables. All of that will help facilitate the electrification of the line through Stirling and on to Dunblane and to Alloa. In 2012, Network Rail invested £26 million, but as part of the Egypt project, clearing bridges to prepare for electrification, including the upgrading of the Carsview Bridge near Cowie. That work cost £2.3 million and involved the original structure, which went back to 1848, being replaced by a modern structure through partnership working with Stirling Council. Now, in doing that partnership working also helped improve approaches and safer road realignment at the same time. Preparing for and delivering electrification between Larbert and Dunblane will represent an investment of almost £90 million, and a further £15 million will be invested in modernisation track works and signalling in and around the Stirling station. This volume activity brings immediate benefits to the Stirling city during this construction phase, through providing contractors with food and accommodation, as well as providing opportunities for local businesses to sell their services. At a very time that we need investment, these programmes of work and investment improvements will be of significant importance and will provide a welcome economic boost for the area. And work will start soon in Stirling, and we will see the replacement of the Seaforth Bridge, the main access point to Riverside and to Forthside. This will be a huge undertaking and involving the closing of a road and bridge from June this year to February 2014. So it's not as if nothing's happening in Egypt. Real work in a real part of Scotland is going on right now, delivering these changes.
Final minute.
Now, obviously, that will create unfortunate disruption for people living in the Riverside having to get about their daily business. But I've been impressed, actually, by the work done not only by Network Rail but also Stirling Council in their work to seek to minimise disruption for all and to provide additional assistance for those who need it during the bridge closure. And I'm also aware that Network Rail have been providing detailed information to communities and businesses affected. In my experience, at all levels, from government down through Network Rail to local community councils and local businesses, both the vision and delivery plans have been well laid out. That's led to a general acceptance that, yes, while there is disruption in the short term, the long-term benefits are there to be achieved by both local people and Scotland as a whole. Egypt is already progressing on the ground for real in Scotland. This is how to do business in modern Scotland. Thank you, and I support the Government's motion.
Thank you. I call Dave Thompson to be followed by Ken McIntosh.
Well, thank you, Presiding Officer. Since 2004, and I do give credit to previous administrations, there have been a great many improvements to Scotland's rail network. It's therefore no surprise that these improvements have led to a significant increase of about 30% in the number of passengers using Scotland's railways. In my own constituency, there have been a good number of improvements already delivered. In December 2012, the new timetable was launched, which added 2 extra services a day between Inverness and the Central Belt, and that's to be welcomed. The Beaulieu station is now a mandatory stop and has gained a couple of stops, one in each direction, between Monday and Saturday. I was also delighted to be present at the reopening of the Conan Bridge station earlier this year, an excellent improvement to the transport links with Inverness, the West and Kyle, as well as the North, Nig and Caithness, and a refreshing different approach in terms of the size of the platform required. I think the smallest platform in Scotland, possibly, just about 7 metres or whatever. Not quite the smallest, Stuart Stevenson tells me, so I bow to his superior knowledge, but very small indeed. In the past, we would have looked at great lengthy platforms on any new station. So, we're making progress in terms of how people think and innovate in terms of improving our railways. It doesn't always have to cost a fortune if you can think a wee bit out of the box. It's also helped with the resurfacing of the Keswick Bridge. It's taken a lot of the pressure of the vehicles crossing the bridge away from the bridge. We've also made progress in eliminating open level crossings on public roads. Network Rail, following a campaign started by myself 5 years ago, just over 5 years ago, have actually started putting barriers on all of Scotland's 23 open level crossings. They've done one down on Ardrossan, which was the pilot. They've done one in Corpach. They're rolling it out for all the others, which are mainly in the Highlands, 21 of them. But not only that, they're actually going to do the same for over 100 open-level crossings in England and Wales. And I'm very, very pleased about that, I would have to tell you. There are various other projects in the pipeline that you've heard about today, and Phase 2 of the Highland Main Line improvement
will increase capacity on the line and decrease journey times in due course between the Highlands and the Central Belt. The target is reducing the shortest journey to 2 hours and 45 minutes. It's also been recently announced that 25 stations around Scotland will have free Wi-Fi, including Inverness and Fort William. I'm pleased about that. And it's also being rolled out on the Class 170s, some of which run between Inverness and other Scottish cities, and the Class 380s. So we'll soon have a third of ScotRail's rolling stock with Wi-Fi. Now, these improvements, already delivered and planned, are welcome and will significantly improve transport links between the Highlands and the Central Belt. And I'm also encouraged to read in today's motion the use of the franchise specifications to better meet the needs of the people of Scotland. And I'm sure this will be the case. I would, however, mention just a couple of points which I think are important. The specifications really must, and I'm sure this will be the case, improve the rolling stock. Many of the journeys to the north, as has already been mentioned, can be 3 or even 4 hours or more in duration. So it's important that we've got rolling stock that is equipped with adequate luggage and cycle storage provisions, comfortable seats, which are very important in terms of our tourist industry and so on, and for other people in Scotland who use these trains. We've got to encourage people onto the trains. And it's not all about time. It's about comfort and the pleasure of the journey. And that includes being able to get something decent to nibble on as well. And I heard Murdo Fraser talking about the infamous British Rail sandwich there. And I do occasionally take the sandwiches on ScotRail, but I prefer the bacon rolls on the South Coast service. I think that's a better service, and that's what we should be aspiring to, the old kind of buffets and a bit of comfort, which will encourage more people back onto the trains. We've also got to continue to improve station facilities in the Highlands. For instance, we still have anomalies and problems with stations like Kingussie, where one of the platforms on the other side from the main station is about a foot lower than the one on the main side, which means that people cannot get disabled access. And since we've now got maybe 2 trains coming in at a time, which is an improvement, it's leading to a problem that disabled passengers can't get on to the, let's say, the southbound one, which is on the other platform, and they have to be taxied to the next nearest station, which could be many miles down the road. So we need to look at these things in the long term as well. I'm also interested, I'll just say a quick word about Transform's proposals to use the Glenfarg line to run directly from Edinburgh to Perth, again, which Murdo Fraser mentioned, and the proposal to save up to 35 minutes in the journey. And yeah, that would be great. And it is something we need to look at in the long term, but it's got to be the long term. But it might well be better to spend any money that we have in actually ensuring dualling the line as much as possible up to Inverness and electrifying the line. That would maybe gain you as many minutes almost as it would reopening the Glenfarg line. So in conclusion, Presiding Officer, we're doing very well, I think, in the railways just now in a very difficult period, and I'm sure we'll do even better after we get independence.
Thank you. Ken McIntosh, to be followed by Nigel Dawn.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. We've enjoyed our usual robust debate on Scotland's future this week. Much of that discussion in the papers and here in the Chamber has focused on our approach to tax, and in particular whether our shared vision for a progressive Scotland is compatible with a race to the bottom on corporation tax. Now, I would suggest that this is a fairly straightforward question to address, although the First Minister managed to avoid doing so earlier, because the answer is clearly no. The two are not compatible. A more contentious issue is whether we need to become an independent country to pursue progressive policies. And I believe our debate this afternoon on transforming Scotland's railways can help shed some light on that question. Yes, we could bemoan the political settlement and blame the Constitution for our inability to reform the way we run our railways, or we could set about using the powers we already have to try to make a difference now. Now, my understanding of the SNP's position is that the Minister and his colleagues were initially quite sympathetic to establishing a not-for-dividend operation to run the Scottish Rail passenger franchise. I'm not entirely sure why that sympathy has not so far been translated into action, but I want to appeal to the Minister and to the SNP to join with us on a new approach to rail in Scotland. Now, first of all, I would suggest there is quite strong public support for reforming the overcomplicated, expensive and downright inefficient rail system we currently enjoy. The recent collapse of the bidding process for the West Coast Main Line franchise, for example, one that the Minister mentioned himself in his opening remarks, has highlighted just how farcical the franchise structure has become. The Scottish Government's motion mentions some of the improvements we have made in recent years, including a welcome increase in passenger numbers, through prioritising this form of public transport, but I believe we could do more. The last Labour UK Government commissioned a review of rail from Sir Roy McNulty to establish value for money. His report found that the cost of operating the rail network across the UK was around 30% more than counterparts on the continent. He identified a number of additional costs which account for this discrepancy, such as interest payments on network rail debt and the expense of managing the relationship between the train operators and Network Rail. What also emerged, however, were the extra costs of the profit taken by train operators, as well as dividend payments to shareholders. Now, we could address that very issue when the Minister puts the current Scottish passenger franchise out to tender, by insisting that the successful franchisee operates on a not-for-dividend basis. Now, we, the Labour Party, have secured legal advice to confirm that the legal powers are there. If the Minister and his SNP colleagues wish to, and he would have our political backing in doing so, the Scottish Government could insist not just that any tender included various community benefit clauses, which I hope he already is doing, but that the service was run on a not-for-dividend basis. Section 26ZA of the 1993 Act allows ministers to use such a clause to stipulate that only a not-for-dividend service will be considered by them to be sufficiently economic and efficient. That would not require any expansion of the devolution settlement, and the franchise would still go out to tender. Mr Harvey.
Patrick Harvey.
I'm grateful to the member for giving way, and I am genuinely interested in this approach, and I don't want to blame constitutional legislation if it's not necessary. But can he tell us where such a not-for-profit bidder would materialise from? It's not just the possibility, it's the practical reality that must be achieved. Where would such a bidder materialise if not without government support in establishing such an organisation?
Ken McIntosh.
Absolutely. There are a number of hurdles to be overcome. I think we have to put together a credible bidder. There are a number of models that do exist currently. For example, the fact that in the absence of a successful franchisee, the government takes over the operation, as it has done with the West Coast Main Line. So these things are possible. But before we cannot even get to the stage of putting together a successful bid if the government will not indicate its political support, because there's a huge bond is required. A huge bond is required by these companies. Now, I think there would be an appetite, for example, for a cooperative to be formed between various cooperative bodies, Strathclyde Passenger Transport, other organisations, including the private sector. Including the private sector, form a cooperative to operate on a not-for-dividend basis that could run this franchise. But we have to show political leadership. Now, we should not use the Constitution as an excuse for inaction. We need to show what we can do now, because at the moment, I'll make some progress, Mr Stevenson. At the moment, rail services in Scotland enjoy around £800 million of public investment, and the rail franchise accounts for the lion's share, £447 million last year, rising to more than £511 million next.
Final minute.
But tackling the issue of ownership of businesses and services goes to the heart of rebuilding a successful, sustainable and progressive economy here in Scotland. I've talked recently about how community ownership of wind farms is a model we should pursue, but I believe a cooperative rail franchise would be a similar step. Not only would the Minister enjoy Labour's political support in this Parliament, the Scottish Government would enjoy the partnership of the Welsh Government in Westminster, in Wales, in Cardiff. Their franchise is not up till 2018, but they've already indicated through their consultation that they wish to pursue this model. We could offer a similar proposal to that put to the people of Wales. It offers value for money to not just the devolved government, but to rail passengers, to the wider community. The ethos of the new organisation running the service could reflect cooperative principles of social responsibility, accountability and equity. There are many significant benefits. Sorry, President Officer.
I'm afraid you must conclude.
There are many significant benefits, which I clearly don't have time to go into now. Minister, this is a once-in-a-decade opportunity. The franchise is going to be awarded for 10 years. We cannot wait for the referendum. We certainly don't need to wait for the referendum, so let's act now. Let's not put Scotland on hold. Let's act together to put this out for a not-for-dividend basis.
Nigel Dawn.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I do want to welcome what the Scottish Government has been able to achieve. And I do really want to be very parochial of this particular debate, because there's quite a lot going on in my constituency. Can I first of all welcome the Government's continuing investment in stations? I'll highlight the three, which are Stonehaven, Laurencekirk and Montrose. The fact also needs to be welcomed that there are more train services, there are more stops. And I also want to note that most of my constituents actually by train go to one of our big cities, to Aberdeen, Dundee, Edinburgh or Glasgow. There are relatively few journeys between the towns in themselves. Now, Stuart Stevenson introduced and others have continued the discussion about different stopping patterns. I think we can see that. What I see particularly on the route down from Stonehaven, from Aberdeen down to Edinburgh, is two different kinds of train. One is the one that's stopping frequently, and the other is essentially the fast train. And I actually think, without going into the details, that we have now got the balance of that timetable something like right. So there are some fast trains, and there are some that are picking up on very large numbers of stops, particularly as they get to their destination first thing in the morning and last thing at night, of course. Can I also mention one thing which I don't think anybody else has yet mentioned, which is the introduction of rules by ScotRail on the consumption of alcohol? I think that's something that I had a discussion with them about many years ago. I didn't think anything would ever happen, and it has, and it's been appreciated. If I could pick up on Stonehaven, the improvements are significant. We've already had automatic doors and a variable height ticket counter, and there are new customer information screens on their way. Dennis Robertson also pointed out that this would be a good park and ride place for Aberdeen, and I do actually have to agree with them. The trouble we have in Stonehaven is there just isn't enough parking space, and I think if the Minister has a magic wand that can generate more parking space, that would be wonderful. It would, of course, also reduce the number of cars on the A90 into Aberdeen, which would be very good for everybody. Moving down the line to Laurencekirk, of course, we have a new station, opened in May 2009, and I pay tribute to those who campaigned for it before I was elected. It has completely overwhelmed expectations. I think they were talking about 30,000 passengers a year. In 2010 and 11, there were 73 and a bit thousand. It's given a huge boost to the town. It's something that prospective developers in the town have actually written into their plans. It's obviously an enormous advantage. If I move further down the line to Montrose, again we see a new footbridge with lifts, which means that we now have disabled access to the northbound platform, which was long overdue and is very welcome. Can I also say that it has a far better view than Jenny Mara's view over the Tay at Dundee. I used to live there. If you come and use the lift at Montrose Station, you can look out over Montrose Basin from that far up. It is a fabulous view, and I think far better than anything on the Tay, to be honest. What you will also see, if you look the other way, but I wouldn't, is a 5-kilowatt wind turbine. This is apparently the first station in the franchise which has actually got its own power generator, and that's quite remarkable. I think it's maybe something to come. Margaret McCulloch actually made the point about tourism, and I have to say that I think that's actually really quite important. Places like Montrose are ones where you could actually get off the train with your bike and then cycle off into the Mearns and North Angus, and I think that's something we must develop. Equally, the moment you head south from Montrose, you hit well, you don't hit it, you go over a bridge, which is single track, and then there's USAN section, which we're well aware of. It is a short stretch, but it does represent a very significant constraint, doesn't it, for timetabling. It's something that it would be good to do something about. Now, my understanding is that in Control Period 6, which starts in 2019, there are moves to see whether something can be done about that. I do wonder, Minister, whether some signalling work might even help even now, and I'm sure those are things which are being worked on. Can I also recognise the Government's work on fairer fares? No, it hasn't been finished. I recognise that. But it's made a significant difference to folk from my constituency. And I think there was a huge amount of public frustration. I don't know quite how people feel about 40 pence between this and that. Maybe most people feel that's not unreasonable, but they're really quite significant sums in splitting the journey from Montrose to Glasgow into 3 tickets are now a thing of the past, and I think that's very welcome. Could I lastly pick up on an issue, though, which is about the wider system? We are still in a position, and I pick it up from my own local constituency basis, we're still in a position where trains and buses do not connect.
Last minute.
Thank you. You cannot get a bus from Brechin, which is all of 10 miles inland from Montrose, which will get you into Aberdeen before 8:45. It simply is not possible to commute by bus and train from Brechin unless you have a 9 o'clock start in the middle of Aberdeen. It seems to me that that is something that needs to be addressed. I have said so to everybody concerned on paper. I still haven't got a result. You could blame me maybe for that, but it does seem to me this is the kind of anomaly that I would like to see change in my constituency, and I suspect 1 or 2 other members might like to see in theirs as well, and that's something else we need to do some work on in time. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm disappointed to note that a couple of members who have participated in the debate are not back for closing speeches. We are tight for time, and I call on John Finney. 6 minutes, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I think it's been a very interesting debate. The Minister touched on the Borders Rail, and I think everyone can recognise the benefits that's associated with an expansion like that. There was mention of the 2 additional trains to the north, and that was in the tail end of 2011 is very welcome, but of course that's now the line at capacity, and that's an issue I'll return to. Rail and cycle hubs were mentioned, but as my colleague Dave Thompson said, we need to maybe get the coach design right for that. There's been a lot of talk about the Aberdeen-Inverness and the Highland Main Line, and perhaps some clarification on definitive timescales from the Minister in his closing would be helpful. Enhancements to the Oban service, the Sunday services are welcome, and a very practical example again mentioned by my colleague Dave Thompson, the Conan Rail link being open, a very modest construction. All the agencies involved, the Highland Council and the Scottish Government, and 2 additional carriages provided during the significant roadworks at the Keswick Bridge. The Labour Party mentioned, both Elaine Murray and Claudia Beamish mentioned the issue of Wales, and I think the principles, particularly laid out by Claudia Beamish, are commendable, and I certainly would agree that more imagination is required. The Independent Green motion talks about recognition of the constraints placed on the ScotRail franchise, and that constraint comes in the form, as many people have said, of Section 25 of the Railways Act 1993 that states that the public sector cannot be a franchisee. Of course, as the Minister alluded to, there is no corresponding ban on foreign public sector bodies being able to bid and operate UK franchises, and that explains why there is a German state-owned Deutsche Bahn locomotive in Waverley now and again, courtesy of their involvement with Arriva. The motion also talks about the Scottish Government ensuring greater transparency with the franchise decision. I think it was Ken. Yes, very brief, please.
Stuart Stevenson.
Just for clarity, I think that is actually a locomotive on lease to ScotRail rather than being Deutsche Bahn directly.
John Finney.
Well, I think you'll find that Deutsche Bahn do operate with Arriva, but whatever the principle stands, I think. The greater transparency with the franchise decision, as Ken McIntosh and others have said, Section 30 talks about the authorities shall provide or secure the provision of services, and it's certainly the providing rather than the securing the provision that our motion talks about. The removal of restraints, well, there's an obvious way to do that, and we also talk about better value for the public investment in Scotland's railways. In 2010, the dividends paid to ScotRail shareholders could have instead, under public ownership, paid for a 7% reduction in fares, and I think that would enjoy widespread public support. I've asked the Minister on a number of occasions about issues around nationalisation and received the replies that we have heard today and many times about it is for individual bidders to come forward. Indeed, he has mentioned previously about the Strathclyde Passenger Transport Executive. I'm very interested, like my colleague Patrick Harvey, in what Ken McIntosh has said, and I would hope the Minister would engage in listening in detail to that, because I think we all want to ensure that the best possible service is there, and to my mind, there's no room for profit in that. The Brown Review was also touched on. And in a reply to me previously, the Minister said the extent to which it would impact is not yet known, so perhaps he would let us know about any lessons that have been learnt from that. We also condemn the UK Government's plan to reprivatise the East Coast Line, and as has been said, the East Coast Rail Service require less public subsidy than the 15 privately run franchises in Britain, and that's a report from the rail regulator, which I would commend to my colleague Alec Johnston, who quite rightly said it's important that we all don't make the same mistakes. Well, clearly the UK Government's intent to making a mistake by returning East Coast back into private hands, with a new operator taking over by 2015. As we know, it's been in the control of the Department of Transport since 2009, and my colleague has given you the figures. An estimated, 640 million in the last 3.5 years, estimated 800 million by the end of the current year. And as has been said, they're perfectly capable of providing fine fare for Mr Fraser and others. It was discourteous that there was no mention made of that with the Scottish Government. We've expressed concerns about the road building programme in our motion, and it's quite clear that there's vast sums to take minutes off journeys for the road building, and it's quite clear that the priority remains the motor car. The motor car is king. Clearly there's competing priorities, and we would view it any cost-benefit. Very quickly, please.
I wonder, in regard to your consideration around the road network, whether you also object to the upgrading of the A9?
John Finney, and you're in your last minute.
Well, if you read the motion, you'll find out that there is a reference to that. The Scottish Government are committing £3 billion to dualling of the A9 to reduce road journeys. And it is certainly our view that it would be better spent, and indeed in the road building aspect, there's people who would believe it would be better spent on the 82. If you had more... There is more freight taken off the road and put on rail would be the less pressure on the road. So, in the short time I've left, a few additional concerns: the carriage of exotic nuclear fuels by waste from Dunlay, the fragmentation of ScotRail services with a separate franchise for the Caledonian Sleeper, which concerns many people, the clauses in the franchise allowing the reimbursement of private operators for revenue lost as a result of industrial action. The First Minister is quoted as saying in the Herald on the 5th of August 2008, railways must at least compete with roads. Well, that's certainly not the case. The Minister's been asked about the Railways Act 1993. As yet, there's no plans to remove profit from the public service that is Scotland's rail work. That's not transformation. It's the status quo, and the public must be central to the provision of public services.
Thank you very much. I now call on Alison McInnes, a very tight 6 minutes.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. It's been an interesting debate. Unusually today, we have 4 separate amendments, each ripping large chunks out of the motion. So there are strong views that all is not well. And I think it's disappointing, therefore, that that wasn't reflected in the SNP backbench contributions. Listening to them, you'd have thought everything was hunky-dory. But I don't wish to be too churlish. The Liberal Democrats do welcome the fact that Scotland's railways are currently enjoying record passenger numbers and high levels of passenger satisfaction. And the Government are right to continue work towards achieving better value for money to rail passengers. But as Elaine Murray and Murdo Fraser noted, all too often the case with this Government is that limited achievements are accompanied by a large helping of complacency. And in what I think could have been a more useful debate about the future of our railways, there was really no need for such a large dose of self-congratulation. The truth is that the Government's plans for our railways show a remarkable lack of ambition. And while I can't agree with the vast bulk of Patrick Harvie's amendment, on one aspect I think he is correct, that for this Government, railways are all too often the poor relation in the transport priorities. In the SNP's 6 years in government, decisions on the ScotRail franchise have been taken with little consideration and little vision for the long-term needs of the network. Improvements between Edinburgh and Glasgow, the Government's flagship rail improvements, have been scaled back and delayed. The reopening of the Borders Railway is behind schedule. And other projects, too numerous to count, have been handed off, sidelined, left to lag forever in the dreaded planning stages. As Tavish Scott's amendment today points out, it is once again the north east of Scotland that is bearing the brunt of the Government's complacency. Trains between Edinburgh and Glasgow and the north east have become slower, they are more overcrowded and they are more expensive. Aberdeen is Scotland's third largest city. It is our energy hub and an international centre of excellence. But instead of making rail the first choice for getting there, it remains a last resort. more locally.
Order.
What was once the Aberdeen Crossrail project, Mr Stevenson, lies in tatters. We are left with the Government's vague Aberdeen-Inverness line improvements, with unquantified benefits to be introduced at unspecified dates. I said earlier I am delighted that after years of campaigning, the Government has finally backed the building of a new station at Kintour. But despite...
Patrick Harvey.
I'm grateful to the member. Does she share my regret that so many politicians beyond the SNP supported the road priorities for that part of the country with the spiralling costs of the AWPR when they could have supported public transport investment?
Alice McInnes.
I'm delighted that we did support the AWPR as part of a package of integrated transport improvements, and it's a disappointment that we're still waiting for that to be delivered. So, despite the unprecedented level of local support for the new station at Kintour, 97% of local residents backed the station in a comprehensive survey I recently carried out. Even that pledge comes from the Government with caveats. By 2019, will help partners to deliver it. Well, the Government should bring forward the new station at Kintour sooner than that, and it would help alleviate some of the traffic congestion at the Hodigan, another transport project that the people of the North East are expected to just keep on waiting for. Currently, Nestrans are being frustrated in their attempts to continue planning work for Kintour while they wait for the GRIP 3 report to be completed. This is already behind schedule, and yet the Government don't seem to be very concerned about encouraging Network Rail to get on with that. Local services continue to suffer. Anyone who has tried to use the train to commute in Aberdeen will know all too well just how busy the trains are. Evening trains from Dice into the city are regularly at almost 150% capacity. If the Government were truly serious about transforming Scotland's railways, they would have made reducing overcrowding a priority in their franchise discussions, rather than leaving it solely up to the franchisee to decide where to direct resources. Presiding Officer, I find the Government's attitude towards our railway services genuinely concerning. I think the fundamental problem is that passenger numbers are at record numbers, not because of the Government's work, but rather despite it. The opening of stations in Alloa, Lawrencekirk and on the Bathgate Link have shown just how much people want to use the railways. Passengers flock to the new stations far in excess of any projections suggested. People do want an alternative to expensive petrol and sitting in traffic jams. But the sad thing is that if the Government weren't so concerned with congratulating themselves on a job half done, there is a real opportunity. But that opportunity should be for all. Mind the gap is advice we often hear on trains. Well, the gap between rail services in rural Scotland and those in the Central Belt is growing ever wider under this SNP Government, and it's time they decided to redress the balance.
Thank you very much. I now call on Gavin Brown. 6 minutes, please.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. The Scottish Conservatives today have attempted to take a balanced approach to this debate, to emphasise that our motion and our contributions the positives for rail and for the Scottish Government, but also to touch on some of the negatives, the challenges, and areas where I think the Government's performance hasn't been up to scratch so far. In terms of positives, I think it is fair to say that the current Scottish Government have done some good things, both in their first term and in the last couple of years. I think it's also fair to say that the previous Scottish Executive, in their time in office, did some good things. It wasn't perfect, of course, but they did some good things in relation to rail. But I think most importantly, we ought to congratulate, as Alex Johnson did, the franchise holders who have done the bulk of the work in terms of getting many of the positive results that we've heard across the Chamber today. And there are some good news stories. We literally went around Scotland over the course of the afternoon, hearing about good developments all over the country. From ScotRail, where we see improved performance and greater satisfaction, we heard from a number of speakers today about the record passenger numbers, up at 83 million, according to the Minister. Everybody should welcome that. We support also the collaborative approach between the industry and the Scottish Government. I think a number of speakers quite rightly have commended the Government on the superior fare structure that we now have compared to the position a decade or so ago. While there is clearly work to be done in relation to that, and we had, I think, some specific examples there, clearly what we have now is better and is set to improve. And, of course, we heard about new services and stations too. In the Minister's contribution, I particularly welcomed the update we got on the Caledonian Sleeper, in relation to the 4 bids thus far, and is planned to take it to the next stage, I think he said in August. And I think we also welcome his announcement in relation to Whifflet. So I think plenty to be satisfied with, but on the other hand, I think a number of speakers have, I hate to use the term again because it's been overused in the debate, but I do think the suggestion that the motion was a little self-congratulatory actually is a fair criticism that has been made by, I think, all of the opposition parties over the course of the debate. Where anything has gone wrong, the position from the government appears to be that it is entirely Westminster's fault because we are at the mercy of Westminster, according to Keith Brown, or it was the fault of the previous Labour and Liberal Democrat executive. We didn't hear, I think, a single admission from any of the government speakers today that actually some of what has gone wrong in the last couple of years is actually down to them, and I think it would be better and more objective debate if they took some responsibility for some of the failings. In particular, Murdo Fraser, I think, made the comment during his contribution that there was a pledge made in 2008 from the First Minister that the journey time between Edinburgh and Inverness would be cut by 35 minutes by 2012. Now, clearly that has not happened. We heard specific information from Tavish Scott in relation to that. I have a letter from my colleague Mary Scanlon which gives a similar picture. We haven't heard any explanation from the Scottish Government, and perhaps the Minister can do so in closing, as to why that specific pledge made by the First Minister hasn't happened, and we'd be very grateful for an explanation in relation to that. There has, I think, been fair criticism of the Scottish Government in last September and in the debate today about Egypt. Bruce Crawford is right. It's not true to say that nothing is happening on the ground in relation to Egypt. Clearly it is. But compared to what was promised, and this was the point I put to him in an intervention, compared to what was promised, we are not getting what the SNP said in their manifesto in 2011. We were told in that manifesto that we would have train times Edinburgh to Glasgow just over half an hour. We were told that we would have the electrification of much of central Scotland's rail network, and what appears to have happened is that the project has been scaled back in terms of size, but also in terms of when it will actually happen on the ground. You're happy to give me to John Mason.
I'm sorry, can we have John Mason's microphone?
Was actually an improvement over what was planned previously.
Gavin Brown, and you're approaching your last minute.
I don't disagree with that at all, but I think to pick out one part where there's been an improvement compared to dozens of parts where there has been a scaling back of the project is small comfort, I think, to many of those who will lose out. Because the Minister, and again Bruce Crawford in his response, again blamed Westminster for the fact that the project has been scaled back. But when I look at the SNP manifesto from 2011, time and again in there it says, despite the reduction in our capital budgets, we will deliver. This was 2011, of course, the year after the comprehensive spending review, where the SNP knew exactly how much money they were going to get for each year within that comprehensive spending review. So any pledge they made in 2011 can be held very carefully, because they knew exactly what was coming. They actually, at the course of various budgets, have been given more money than they thought they were going to receive. So it's not acceptable to blame anybody else for those failings other than themselves. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And I now call on Richard Baker, 8 minutes.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. We have welcomed the chance to debate the future of Scotland's railways, and while many of us have found the government motion cloyingly self-congratulatory, it has been good to have debated a substantive issue in Scottish Government time, nor have any of us said there's been no progress on our railways. Over the course of devolution, we have had the opportunity to bring a new focus on our rail services, and Tavish Scott was quite right to say, this started with the first Scottish Executive in our coalition, when we looked at the transport policy we inherited, and there was a greater focus on rail than had been previously. There wasn't a myopic focus on new road provision. So I think devolution has got a great deal of credit on its side in terms of developing rail policy. Some of the benefits we are now seeing. But we have nevertheless voiced concerns over a number of areas in terms of rail policy. We've voiced concerns about the limitations of the current franchise arrangements, and an issue to which I will return. But we've have welcomed aspects like the new Wi-Fi services, which First ScotRail are providing. A number of members referred to the investment in station facilities, which Margaret McCulloch referred to. And of course, we all appreciate, I'm sure, the readiness of ScotRail staff to engage with us in this Parliament on the issues we bring to them on behalf of our constituents. So, it's right to recognise progress where it's been made, but it's also right to acknowledge where the concerns exist. And we still don't know what the provisions of the next franchise will be. I think we should be relieved that so much of the Rail 2014 consultation document was dumped, because that included proposals for closing stations, for ending cross-border rail services, for longer journey times. But it's good that after the campaigns by trade unions and the concerns raised in this chamber, a lot of those proposals have already gone. But the fact that they were even under consideration shows that we, as a Parliament, must scrutinise carefully the Scottish Government's plans for the provision of the franchise to ensure we do achieve actual improvements and not diminution of services. And when we look at rail infrastructure in Scotland, this Scottish Government's record is distinctly underwhelming. The Liberal amendment refers to the fact reported yesterday by the Aberdeen Evening Express that over the past 6 years, journey times between Aberdeen and the Central Belt have actually increased. Members have mentioned the commitments in Aberdeen in Inverness to the Central Belt, which have not been made either. Perhaps Mr Stevenson will explain to us why those commitments have not been fulfilled by this government.
Stuart Stevenson.
I wonder if the member will acknowledge that by taking many of the stops in Fife off key connections between Aberdeen and Edinburgh, we've delivered faster journey times and, of course, additional rail services between Edinburgh and Dundee to fill in the gaps thus created. Averages and medians are different things.
Richard Baker.
Mr Stevenson loves his averages and medians and his statistics, but he's been very, very selective with them. What I will say to Mr Stevenson is what is highly regrettable was a decision made, I think when he was Transport Minister, no doubt he'll correct me if he wasn't, to scrap the Aberdeen Crossrail project, as Alison McInnes said, which would have actually achieved, as Dennis Robertson quite rightly said, should have an ambition for much more frequency and through services Stonehaven to Inverurie. That was Aberdeen Crossrail, and it was a disgrace that, having campaigned for so long for it in opposition, when plans far advanced by the last executive, it was unceremoniously dumped by the SNP. And given, as Mr Scott said as well, the importance of Aberdeen to our economy, that was a hugely regressive decision. But not the only victim. Edinburgh to Airport Rail Link, the Glasgow Airport Rail Link, and of course the significant cuts of a third to Egypt, which have meant that gains from that proposal have been lost. We will not realise all the advantages we could have had. That has been an extremely regrettable decision as well. And when you think about that project as being a shovel-ready project, we keep hearing about shovel-ready projects, and also would have been funded through Network Rail borrowing capacity, so was not subject to the big swinging cuts in capital investment we've heard of. That decision is bewildering, and I think serves Scotland and our economic progress poorly. So, the Scottish Government have been keen to blame others too for delays. In last week's debate on their failure to progress work at the Haddington roundabout in Aberdeen, they had the temerity to blame opposition parties for delays in Border Rail, when it was the Minister's own failed procurement process which has resulted in the huge delays to that project as well. That was quite breathtaking stuff, even from this government. So everything is not rosy in the garden, and all the opportunities for an improved rail service in Scotland have not been secured by ministers. Indeed, in the case of Egypt, the cuts to the scheme will actually result in longer journey times in some instances. And given the tough targets the Scottish Government has set itself on CO2 emissions, which so far it's failed to achieve, I would be interested to know what assessment was made on the environmental impact of not implementing Egypt in full, which would have done far more to attract more people, even more people, onto our rail services. But the award of the new franchise does present the Government an opportunity, as Ken McIntosh said, to secure improved services. And that's why we have said in our motion that it's vital we look at all the options we have for how the new franchise will be operated, not least because of the huge sums of public money which the franchise receives, £511 million this year. So, as Elaine Murray and Ken Macintosh both said in their contributions, it's time for ministers to look seriously at the potential for a mutual option for the ScotRail franchise. And we've had warm words from ministers on this, but nothing else in terms of practical action. And this won't just happen on its own. And if there are limitations being placed on what the Scottish Government can do around the potential for a mutual bid for the franchise, and I'd hope that ministers will join their counterparts in the Welsh Government, who have, as Elaine Murray said, already raised with the Department for Transport the issue of a fair level playing field for all franchisees, whether they be not for dividend or profit seeking. But as Ken Macintosh also said, the legal advice on this is not as clear-cut as the Minister would have us believe. We do not believe this has been in any way tested by ministers. We know they're not reluctant to tell us about their legal advice, but we've certainly received some on this issue, and we believe it gives ministers a greater capacity than they say they have to explore these alternative options for delivery of rail services in the future. And it is our intention on this side to work with our colleagues in the Cooperative Party and the trade union movement to promote such an option and greater accountability in the provision of our rail services in the future. And when it comes to the future, we remain in the dark on the Scottish Government's proposals for our railways under their unpopular plans for separation. But perhaps the Minister will enlighten us on these in his closing speech. This is important because our rail services are crucial to our country and to our economy, and we believe there is no cause for ministers to rest on any laurels, but instead to get on with the work of delivering the better rail network we should all be aspiring to in Scotland.
Many thanks. I now call on Keith Brown to wind up the debate. Minister, you have until 5 o'clock.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer, and thank you also to those who participate in the debate. It's been, I think, a very interesting debate. I think it also acknowledges that rail services play a crucial part in connecting people and businesses across Scotland, and because of that deserve the attention and recognition of the Parliament. Obviously, I had the temerity to point out in the motion one or two things which I thought the Government were doing quite well, and that was a misjudgment, because I understand from what's been said, if I'd pointed out all the areas where we've still got to make progress, and I said in the motion that we have to make further improvements, then the other parties could have bailed in and said what a great job the Government was doing. That was the only thing that stopped the other parties recognising the progress that we've made. So, misjudgment on my part there. As I set out in my opening words, the Government, I believe, is not alone, but the Government is playing a part in transforming the railway, and the benefits have been recognised by passengers, as is shown in the high levels of passenger satisfaction, which is not the same as saying everybody is getting exactly the service they should. Of course, we have to improve things further. But at a time when public spending is being massively constrained by cuts imposed by the Westminster Government, there is no question that's a factual statement, we have managed, despite that, to increase our commitment. And I have to say, I mentioned already that there are a number of suggestions in ways in which we could enhance the network even further than we're currently doing, or reduce fares further, or provide further services, or other projects. And there was that statement that was made, I think, this morning, where the statement was made in relation to the Perth line, which Murdo Fraser mentioned, that there was no shortage of money. Well, I'm afraid there is a shortage of money. And also we heard, quite rightly, from individual members, I think it was referred to by somebody as wish lists. Everybody has areas that they like to see in the local area to be improved, and I understand that point. I've done the same thing in my own area as well previously on the council. I understand that point, but yes, I will.
Mary Scanlon.
Can I just say that my wish list would be the train times between Edinburgh and Inverness. Nicola Sturgeon said the train times have been reduced by 35 minutes. Yet the man who runs the train, Steve Montgomery, Managing Director of ScotRail, confirmed in a letter to me that one train has been reduced by 11 minutes. Will you now apologise and make the record clear, apologise for misleading the Parliament?
Minister.
No, I don't believe I've misled the Parliament, so I have no intention of apologising. If I can say once again that people do have their individual wish lists, I think there's many areas in which people have had some long-term ambitions realised by projects which have been undertaken by the Government. But I think we also have to recognise there have been decades of underinvestment in the railways. It's also true, in fact, in relation to the road network. If anybody wants to oppose that point of view, they're free to do so. I'll take the intervention, but decades of underinvestment. So what we're doing just now is trying to roll back some of that. It was mentioned the presentation that we had from Virgin Railways in the Parliament, I think it was on Tuesday night. And the chap from Virgin said that there was a proposal, I think it was the Serpol report it was called, in the early 1980s, which essentially proposed that the railways in Scotland should comprise Edinburgh to Glasgow and Point South and nothing else. That was the proposal. And he said there was no real opposition to that. There was no real fanfare of opposition to the fact that that could be the limit of the railways in Scotland. And we have seen, and he said nobody was interested, this was his view, nobody was interested in railways or expanding the railway network. Now, Tavish Scott said, recognise what's been done by previous governments. And I'm happy to do that. I think I'm always happy to do that. And I don't think she's sitting here just now, but Sarah Boyack, who's been mentioned as the first Transport Minister, was the person I approached in 1999 when, as leader of Clackmannshire Council, I'd taken forward a proposal to try and reopen the Stirling, Allowick and Carden line. And Sarah Boyack, to her credit, allocated the largest ever funds under the Public Transport Fund, it was called at that time, around £6 million at the second time of asking to the Council. Of course, by the time we got through to Tavish Scott, it changed to £85 million and it had become a freight line and had taken many years to get to that stage. But there was the foresight there to make that money available. And of course, previous administrations, and especially under devolution, administrations have done things to advance the case for rail travel in Scotland. I believe that what we're seeing just now is massively greater than the improvements we've seen up to that point. And it may be, I think as Tavish Scott hinted, that because there was a major shift made at that time, so perhaps a slow start but a change in direction. But I believe we have invested massively in rail and we're seeing the benefits of that now. We are accelerating the investment which is planned for the next control period. I've mentioned already the Whifflet route electrification by summer 2014. That will actually start next month, years ahead of the plans which we previously proposed. That underlines the importance that we attach to the rail industry and the confidence we have in its ability to help us realise sustainable economic growth. And we won't price the growth of the network. We will support and sustain it. It's interesting, some of the views that we have expressed in here about the state of the railways in Scotland. I've done a number of interviews recently, one for BBC Yorkshire, who have said that they are very envious of what's happening in Scotland, both in terms of fares, bearing down on fares to an extent which the previous Labour government and the current Conservative Liberal Democrat government in Westminster haven't done. They have made some changes recently, but we've done it far faster and far quicker. And there are places across the rest of the UK, as was mentioned in one or two speeches, where there's real envy about what's happening in terms of the railways in Scotland. And I've mentioned the fact there's a transformation going on. I'll say again, it's not entirely completely due to the government. Of course, it's other partners that are involved in that. But it would be nice to have that recognised, perhaps, in the Chamber, because it's certainly been recognised out with the Chamber. Industry alliancing, which I've mentioned, and industry regulation is starting to ensure we get real value for money. The investments we make in Control Period 5 from 2014 to 29 will offer faster and better connected services on improved infrastructure, connecting more and better stations. I spoke earlier of large-scale projects, many of which have been mentioned by other members as well. The £650 million investment in the Edinburgh to Glasgow improvement project, which shouldn't really be characterised as Egypt. I have no responsibility for Istanbul or Cairo, but Egypt, it's £650 million, a huge investment, delivering significant benefits for Scotland, plus major refurbishments at Haymarket Station, which, if you get the train regularly there, as I do, you'll see that way that train station is being transformed, and Queen Street, of course, in the longer term. We're looking forward to the ambitious plans that we have for high-speed rail, ensuring resilience and better journey times between our two largest cities in future. It would have been nice, perhaps, for some of the UK-based parties to have said what they think about the UK government's attitude towards high-speed rail coming to Scotland. There was no commitment from the previous government. There's no commitment from the current government. Why is there not a commitment to that? Why are we not seeing productive working happening between... Well, I'm going to come back to Jenny Marra's points shortly, so if we make some more progress first of all. In the shorter term, the recent announcement I've made of £5 million to fund station improvements will help us to improve stations such as Gleneagles ahead of the Ryder Cup in 2014, and to make lasting improvements to benefit passengers across the network. Improved integration, and it was mentioned, between bus and rail in particular. And there is an issue here. It's not easy to resolve because, of course, there are different operators. But we've already said that within that franchise agreement, we will oblige the bidders that come forward to lay out their plans for making sure there is proper integration between different modes of transport. Just to come back to the amendments, if I can, first of all. The amendment proposed by the Green Independent Group, I have to say I'm quite surprised to find there was virtually nothing I could agree with in John Finney's closing statement, and not least in relation to the A9. We are committed to the A9. We will fund the cost of doing that. It should have been done many years ago. We will do that at the same time as investing in our railways. The Liberal Democrats, I think Alison McInnes basically said the improvements in rail services, whether it was 83 million passengers, had nothing to do with the government. I don't know how you can come to that conclusion. I'm not saying it's the case that it's all down to us, but whether it was stations, bearing down on fares, the new lines, the exponential growth that we've seen in patronage, it must have had something to do with the government. And I think we have done some things which have encouraged that. I think we had the same line, essentially, from Gavin Brown, who said it was really down to the franchise holders. There was some recognition of some improvements which the government was responsible for, but it was down to the franchise holders. The point about the Labour Party, though, there's a number of points made, and Ken McIntosh's point I should come back to. I repeat the point I made before, that if you wanted to have, which has been suggested, and I'm not talking just now about the not for dividend proposal, but for the publicly owned proposal, the only way you can do that is if Scotland becomes independent. And I know there are people in the Labour Party who like the idea of 100 years of Tory rule more than Scotland taking its own decisions, but that's the only way you can do that. In relation to the specific proposal that Ken McIntosh made, I think the issue there is, and I've tried to answer this before, and I will look into it further because he's asked me to do that. But the specific point I've tried to make to him is that we have always said we will look favourably on any proposals that come forward, including those which might be not-for-profit or mutually based. There are practical strictures, one of which is the bid has to show some evidence of experience of running railways, which makes it difficult. There's no question of that. But it's also true to say we're not allowed to favour one form of bid over another. And that would be, I think, equally true of saying we can only accept one kind of bid. So I think those are the practical issues. But I'll listen to what he said and we'll look at that further. I think in relation to the capital works which he's talked about, I don't think, sorry, it was Richard Baker in summing up that mentioned this point, I don't think you have the basic understanding of how capital projects are funded. I'm on a point just now. I don't think you understand that the RAB is not just a shelf full of money you can pull down and there's no cost to it. This money has to be paid for. It's got to be paid back for with interest rates. And if you want to propose further spending, you're open to do that when it comes to the budgets. You've never done it in previous discussions. You have the chance to do that. So throughout the period that we've had control of this, I think there has been continuous improvement, a major step change projects. I realise I've not come back to Jenny Mara, but I will write to her on the point that she's raised. This government is, I believe, transforming Scotland's rail system to deliver integrated services that are affordable and responsive to Scottish passengers' needs. And in that light, I'd ask for the Parliament's support for the motion.
Thank you very much. That concludes the debate on motion number S4M 06766 on transforming Scotland's railways, and it's now time to move to the next item of business, which is consideration of a parliamentary bureau motion on the suspension and variation of standing orders for the purpose of considering the Crofting Amendment Scotland Bill. And I would ask Joe Fitzpatrick to speak to and move motion number S4M 06781.
Presiding Officer, when the Minister for Environment and Climate Change made a statement on the 27th of March on the issue of Crofting, he said that it was his intention to propose a timetable for the bill which would enable the Parliament to consider carefully the proposed changes whilst ensuring the matter is resolved quickly. This motion allows for the suspension of a number of standing orders for the purpose of parliamentary consideration of the expedited process of the Crofting Amendment Scotland Bill. I move the motion.
Many thanks. And the question on that motion will be put at decision time, to which we now come. There are 6 questions to be put as a result of today's business. And I remind members that there are a number of possible pre-emptions should amendments to motion S4M 06766 on transforming Scotland's railways be agreed to. If the amendment in the name of Elaine Murray is agreed to, all subsequent amendments on the motion will fall. If the amendment in the name of Alex Johnson is agreed to, amendments in the name of Tavish Scott and Patrick Harvey will fall. And finally, if the amendment in the name of Tavish Scott is agreed to, the amendment in the name of Patrick Harvey will fall. The first question is that amendment S4M 06766.2 in the name of Elaine Murray, which seeks to amend motion number S4M 06766 in the name of Keith Brown on transforming Scotland's railways, be agreed to. Are we all agreed? The Parliament is not agreed, and therefore we will move to a vote. Members should cast their votes now, please. Order. The result of the vote on amendment number 6766.2 in the name of Elaine Murray is yes 38, no 69. There was one abstention. The amendment is therefore not agreed. The next question is that amendment S4M 06766.1 in the name of Alex Johnson, which seeks to amend motion number S4M 06766 in the name of Keith Brown on transforming Scotland's railways, be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Yes. The Parliament is not agreed, and therefore we will move to a vote. Members should please cast their votes now. The result of the vote on amendment number 6766.1 in the name of Alex Johnson is yes 11, no 98. There were no abstentions. The amendment is therefore not agreed. The next question is that amendment S4M 06766.3 in the name of Tavish Scott, which seeks to amend motion number S4M 06766 in the name of Keith Brown on transforming Scotland's railways, be agreed to. Are we all agreed? No. Parliament is not agreed. Therefore, we will move to a vote, and members should please cast their votes now. Order. The result of the vote on amendment number 6766.3 in the name of Tavish Scott is yes 49, no 60. There were no abstentions. The amendment is therefore not agreed. The next question is that amendment S4M 06766.4 in the name of Patrick Harvey, which seeks to amend motion number S4M 06766 in the name of Keith Brown on transforming Scotland's railways, be agreed to. Are we all agreed? No. Parliament is not agreed. Therefore, we will move to a vote, and members should please cast their votes now. The result of the vote on amendment number 6766.4 in the name of Patrick Harvey is yes 4, no 105. There were no abstentions. The amendment is therefore not agreed. The next question then is that motion number S4M 06766 in the name of Keith Brown on transforming Scotland's railways be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Parliament is not agreed. Therefore, we will move to a vote, and members should please cast their votes now. Order. The result of the vote on motion number 6766 in the name of Keith Brown is yes 59, no 49. There was one abstention. The motion is therefore agreed to. And that brings us to the final question this evening, which is that motion number S4M 06781 in the name of Joe Fitzpatrick on the suspension and variation of standing orders be agreed to. Are we all agreed? The motion is therefore agreed to. That concludes decision time, and I now close this meeting of Parliament.